this should come up live any minute now on my phone. There's a delay.
All right. Looks like you're
Okay,
in mourning today.
there we go. In morning,
Yeah.
before I go
Like your
black.
beard, goes into your shirt. It just looks like one big beard. All right.
Yeah, so welcome back. We are live on the stream there. I already have some people commenting, so that's good. I just want to bring up, I just made a little thing for myself here. Okay. Yeah, we already got some people commenting here. Let's see. I wonder what rebel Judaism means. I just mean that in the traditional Orthodox view, anything that says I'm going to do something a little bit different is rebellious by nature. In my opinion, that's what it looks like from the.
It's a
And then
mixed dancing, as the Orthodox would say.
I find Ash's stance on Christianity at minimum intellectually honest. Yeah, I try to take a very open-minded and a clear approach there. I appreciate that, guys. Thank you. All right, so um, okay, so if you can hear me clearly, we should be good to go there. Um, for anyone that doesn't know, last time we had a conversation, I didn't know much about you, which is why I wanted to have you on and get an understanding of your take on things from your take on Judaism. Understand what it is, the value that you bring to people that are looking for some kind of meaning in life, and so on. Take on people that are, let's say, more malicious to other outside groups and religions, and so on. I tried to get a clear understanding. I like your approach as far as not being stuck in the mud, so to speak, um, and providing people with, at the very least, something pragmatic to give some kind of meaning and purpose to life and a way to live properly. But the reason I didn't want to get into too much of it last time, I just wanted to get an understanding and get to know you a little bit. Um, I think we agree on a lot. I think there's some things that I wanted to clarify and maybe push back on a little bit and get a clear understanding of exactly what the depths of some things are. Not in any way to make this a debate. I don't think that's productive or anything like that. Nor do I have a necessarily a stance contra or against. It's just that I want to maybe push the boundaries of it a little bit and see where it goes. Um, so specifically, I wanted to ask. I just want to clarify a few things from. I haven't had a chance to go back over the whole stream, but just from memory, I made a few notes today. Uh, I wanted to clarify. So when I asked you about um, what you're presenting to people as an option in their lives, specifically to Jewish people, not just people that convert, um, you said something about a very clear system of theology. You're presenting them with a clear package of a way to live in accordance with the God of the Torah. Correct?
Not necessarily. I mean, I even view belief in God as secondary. Um, I think believing in God doesn't mean much if you're believing in the wrong God. What I emphasize more is individual moral training, the 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 ethics and the morality espoused by this God, but not necessarily theological metaphysical concepts.
Okay. So as far as theology, you're less concerned. You're trying to present this is what the this is what the Torah presents to us. This I believe is God's instructions to us,
Yeah.
and His nature and those kinds of things and questions are less relevant. It's more how do we follow this for a meaningful life and for connecting to God in the way that He has prescribed to us. Does that make sense?
Correct. Yeah. Well, God Himself in the Torah n- never set up a ladder for us to meet with Him or to get to know Him. It seems like He was more concerned about how we treated each other than how we treated or viewed Him. Theology or spirituality is quite minimal in the Torah. There isn't even a biblical Hebrew word for the spiritual. Right? The modern concept of spirituality is man's attempt to tap into the metaphysical, right? But it seems like the Torah is more preoccupied on us getting along, right? And in any way trying to understand what can't be seen and what you essentially can't control doesn't matter.
So you think that delving into the this so I think we agree there on the Kabbalistic side, for example, where people are trying to know God in a way that is obviously not prescribed and is concocted because people are desperate for, they want to know the answer. They want to the what's and ifs and so on. Um, that's definitely, like, I think we agree they're counter biblical. But the question that I'm trying to get at here is, if we don't understand God to an extent of what He's actually telling us about Himself, right, or what He wants from us in general, as a whole holistic picture of what God is expecting, right? How do we know? Because the Torah is not very clear, right? The Torah has a lot of ambiguities, a lot of we don't know how to fulfill that mitzvah per se unless we have a rabbinical tradition that carries on, and I think we'll probably get into that a little bit as well. But um, how do we go about knowing what is the how do I put this? What is the overarching theme that keeps everything together for you? Meaning, if we have a bunch of halachot and things like that, are we just doing things for the sake of doing them, or is there a purpose, a meaning, a direction that keeps a buffer on the ends of everything to keep it
Well,
all
what
running
does the Torah
smoothly?
say in terms of why we should keep commandments? Halachot aside, because I make a distinction between rabbinic laws and Torah laws. It seems that the culmination of us living by this moral standard is seeing our children grow old, having rain in its proper season, and ultimately peace. Practical results that we can see on earth, mainly because most commandments are in some way ethically reciprocal, right? Like the punishment is bundled into the action itself. If like for some reason you don't allow your land to rest, you're gonna burn the nutrients out of it, right? If you don't honor your parents, if you don't uh, uh in some way hold those accountable who show favoritism and judgment, I mean, society just couldn't move forward ethically. It seems like it's there for you to give you something to package to hand over to the next generation. But it seems that God only really presents himself in the Torah in two ways, and that's just and righteous. And then he laid down the law. He says, I'm fair, and essentially by emulating me, things could improve in your life. All right. I mean, he never said, try to understand where I came from and what's the purpose of creation, right? It seems that people nowadays are way too preoccupied with the afterlife, if there is one, than the here and now.
Well, even on a
And
pragmatic standpoint, without worrying about afterlife and any of that, when we're talking about the Torah, right? You're specifically talking about the Tanakh, and you're
well, the
specifically
five books of
you're
Moses in
talking about
particular.
that's what I was going to get. Narrowing that down, you're specifically talking the five books of Moses. So you don't really care so much what the prophets are saying. You don't care what the book of Job is saying, right? Eov. You're
Mhm.
not so concerned with that.
Well, I don't view Nevi'im or Ketuvim as the Word of God. I believe that they're there to bring you back to the Word of God. They're there to amplify the Word of God, which is essentially what the Torah says the Word of God is, which is the revelation that came through Moses. Um, so I think the rabbis had the authority to sanction books to study, but the idea that every generation, because of some poetry, symbolism, or hyperbole in the prophets, is going to think every generation that they're living in the last generation, I think hurts us more than it helps us. So yeah, no, the only true word of God is the Torah.
I'm just going to make a adjustment here with the audio because I'm being told it's too low, as you were mentioning. Let's
Mhm.
try this here.
Testing, one, two, three.
I think I'm missing the final stage here to boost that up. Let's see this.
One, two, three. Mic check, mic check. One, two.
Can you hear me a little bit better now, everyone?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. You're
That's a lot
actually
better.
louder. Yeah.
Okay,
Mhm.
that's good. Let's pull this back up. So as long as that's coming in clearly, that's good.
Now I feel it. This is
Yeah, I
good.
appreciate that, Kenneth. I really appreciate that. Thank you for letting me know. So, so that this is the thing, right? So you're talking about rabbinical authority. From your perspective, it does guide the Torah. You believe that it did, in fact, predate the Second Temple period. You think it actually does go back, and that's why it has the authority to continue that till today. It's an unbroken line from Moses, correct?
Correct, but I make a distinction between any such authority and the authority that appears in the Torah itself. It's like, for example, This was the traditional opinion, I think, before Kabbalists took over Judaism. You don't have to do what's called mechila or teshuvah when you break a rabbinic command. That was the understanding. You just sort of get back on that horse. However, when you let God down, when you break an actual Torah command, that's when you do mechila. That's when you repent and promise to next time do it correctly, right? That's a distinction that people do not make nowadays. Why? Because we acknowledge that one is man-made, although still sanctioned by God, and one it's Torah itself, right? So I don't think anyone's going to come to love the God of Israel or Judaism because of what appears in Jewish law,
I
right?
think we'll
I
get
mean,
into
it's
that a little bit. I'm going to ask you
yeah,
about
yeah. Okay, good.
Noah hides and things like that as
Mm,
well, because I think that's another thing that has come up recently that I didn't know as much about, and recently getting attacked on my channel by the minions of Singer and so on. Um, so so there seems to be, and this is where I was getting at. There's like the crux of it is here. There seems to be a self contradicting stance here because the rabbinical tradition that you hold to that gives the authority to give rabbinic interpretations of how to perform the mitzvot and how to keep the law, the same rabbinic tradition that does that also clearly delves into, I don't want to say the esoteric because I don't want to mix the idea that Kabbalah is genuine here because I think we both agree hardcore
mhm,
that is not. That is a hard stop. Um, but when you look at the in the Talmud and earlier midrashic texts and parallel midrashic texts, the ideas of Mashiach, messianic ideas, spiritual ideas that are predate Kabbalah, for example, and the idea that we do look to the prophets for guidance on how to do things. It just, from my perspective, it seems picky and choosing what's convenient, but there's an obvious importance placed on things like the prophets, on things like Eov, right? So, for example, when you say to me that this the laws have a built-in system that makes it work, right, in your favor to have a productive society, which is why I think you're coming at it from a very pragmatic standpoint. And I think overall for society, when you say that why you like other religions is because inherently they're going to be following more of the laws by default than an atheist would, I agree with that. I understand that completely. But at the same time, you're missing certain key elements, which is you can do everything perfectly in accordance with that system and things go wrong. And God prescribes us a book to read called Eov, which most Orthodox Jews do believe is Orthodox Jews and Christians all believe is an inspired text of the Bible, right? That has a genuine message of God speaking to us, right? And it's to an extent it's there for solving the problem of evil, right? Which it seems to be lacking as a backstop and a safety in your system. Meaning, if somebody goes, "Well, I converted to Judaism through you, right? You brought me to this beautiful tradition. I follow these laws, and then I'm suffering immensely." And that's why I asked you last time. Do you know anyone in your community um, that has gone through some kind of traumatic, immense suffering? Because I think that's a key thing that until you encounter it, right, it doesn't really come up. People like to keep that in the side, but that is a reality of life. You could be um, following all the laws. You have communities in India and things like that, right?
mhm,
So somebody in some other place in the world, and
mhm.
a group of militia comes through and slaughters them, or whatever else it is, right? And you go,
How
"Well,
do
I'm
you come to the
following."
conclusion that Job was given to us by God to in some way elevate us? Because it seems from this perspective that you're deifying the rabbis more than I do, because it was essentially the rabbis
Well, not deifying the
who
rabbis, admitting that they have a that this has always existed in Jewish tradition, long before the rabbinical system as we know it, that these books were things that were being read and passed around as inspired texts. So
by
this
the
is
judges essentially, like by the
by the
judges,
judges. Yeah.
like who later on were called rabbis. But when you know that they in some way sanctioned these books, like why did you say that God in some way sanctioned these books? Right? I mean, I can make a distinction with the judges, but it seems like you failed to make the distinction.
No, so what I'm saying
For
is
example,
this has always been accepted from
no, but how do we know? I mean, how do we know? I mean, outside of the Torah,
because they're quoted by the rabbinical traditions and by Christian traditions, which is the only two schools that have any tradition going back to
oh
it,
no, I get it. Yeah, but
that
the
they
Torah
are
never
inspired.
sanctioned these books, right? And for example, the Vilna Gaon, right? And no one would deny that the
That's
Vilna Gaon is not
anachronistic
part of the.
because um, the book of Devarim is not sanctioned by the book of Shemot, right? It's the tradition that gives it to you.
Right, no, yeah, but it claims to be, I mean, coming from an authoritative source with the idea that God plays chess with people's lives, or puts bets on people's, like, well, levels of observance, I mean, seems a little odd, right? For example, the Vilna Gaon like believed that it didn't actually occur. Maimonides also believed that Sefer Yov like didn't occur. It's more like of a mushal. When he says it's a mushal, that means a mushal developed by the judges, because we still don't know when Job existed, if he did exist, or who wrote the book of Job. But I think you've taken a leap, and you said that only because it's been accepted post the Torah. I'm pretty sure that you acknowledge that it got accepted after the Torah, right? It was in some way given to us by God. All I'm saying is that the Torah never sanctioned any other book, right? Or for sure any other book that would add or take away from the initial commandments as word of God. Now, I appreciate Tanakh. I appreciate the writings and the prophets to in some way amplify the Torah, because we know that a prophet can add one commandment to the Torah, he's taken on and stoned. So it means that if we in some way add to the Torah because of what appears in the prophets, we may be reading the prophets incorrectly. So I'm just trying to amplify the Torah while keeping these other books as books that are sanctioned as worthy of study, instead of calling them the word of God. How I believe it's incorrectly referred to today.
So you think that you think that the prophets are purely poetic?
So I want people to know that when you're saying the prophets, you mean the books of the prophets, not necessarily the prophets, right? We have a commandment to listen to prophets. We don't have a commandment to write down a supposed prophecy, right? Which I believe was only applicable in and around the life and times of that prophet. And I believe every prophecy is conditional. That means it either already occurred or expired. The notion that because I may question some hyperbole or poetry that appears in the prophets, I'm questioning the role of prophecy, right? I mean, that's not my position, because I don't think something told to Jews in Babylon had anything in any way, anything applicable to Jews in Muncie in 2005, right? Unless it's there to instill you with the sense of fear and awe, to show you how God acted and reacted throughout Jewish history, to in some way bring you back to the Torah, but not that it's telling you something further.
Okay. So my question then is, the system that you work in, right, for your community, is heavily based on the Rambam, right?
Uh, yes, I mean, for the most part, I do disagree with the Rambam on some things, but
Do you
yes, keep
accept the
going.
13 principles of faith?
No, no, I do not. And I'm not the only rabbi who disagreed with the Rambam's rendition of the 13 Principles. I mean, the Ravid, Rav Yosef Albo. I mean, there's a whole book called the "With the Limits of Orthodox Theology" by Rabbi Mark Shapiro, that talks about the rabbis who disagreed with his rendition of the 13 Principles, which he basically just picked from Perek Helek of the Talmud on certain things that rabbis happen to believe in. But for example, I mean, there's contradictions in his statement to begin with. Like, for example, that the Torah we have nowadays is the same one that Moses had. When elsewhere he says that the Aleppo Codex is the most trustworthy source to copy Torah scrolls from. What he's basically saying is that there were other options, right? Like, he made Judaism, or he gave Judaism a creed when Judaism never had a creed. And that's the problem that people had with it. Not that they didn't necessarily embrace all of those principles, right? I mean, like, for example, one objection that Rabbi Yosef Albo had was like, how can you say that one has to believe every day that Mashiach might come, when it says that Hillel, the Amara Hillel, like in the Talmud, said the Messiah already came? Like, was he a heretic? Was he outside the fold? So I know that it's been accepted, right? Almost wholeheartedly in the Jewish community, the 13 principles. But I think in the more Haredi, the more academic circles, they they can't ignore, like when like the Ravid says in Hilchos Tshuva, when the Rambam says that anyone who believes that God has any corporeal quality to him, that they lose their share in the world to come. He responds to the Rambam and he says, how can you say that when rabbis bigger than you believe that God had a body, had a shape? Right? I mean, even the rabbis in the Talmud believe that God wore tefillin, God wore,
Well,
like a
there's an
tallis.
interesting discrepancy in that philosophy, which is that you say that God has no corporeal or human aspect at all,
Mhm.
um, but he has a voice. Well, he doesn't have a shape, he doesn't have a body, but he has a voice. Okay, but a voice is a corporeal aspect, so it's kind
Oh,
of
for sure.
it's archaic thinking to distinguish the two. But
Well, the Rambam answers that, by the way. You know, any communication between man and God from the Rambam's perspective occurred in a dream. So obviously the Torah doesn't say that, right? I mean, the notion of a bat kol, which is I think what you're referring to, also doesn't say that. But he covers all his bases.
Even the voice of God at Sinai, right? It's like
Right.
you
The
have to
first two
understand that
commandments.
God is relating to us in a way that is immanent in the world. I mean, there's
Right.
if you believe in the Torah that
Yeah.
you can't have a mystical approach of a transcendent God that is has to be like there's without getting into the
Yeah.
kabbalistic aspect of
Well,
it because I don't think it's that interesting.
but
But
it leads me to believe that you also disagree with some of the 13 principles as well.
um, so what I was getting at with that though is, do you believe in Mashiach, for example? Do you believe in a Messiah?
So I like the notion brought down by Maimonides. It's interesting that the Talmud speaks about not just the Messiah, it talks about the resurrection of the dead, Techiatem 18, but it never tells you what it is. It never tells you what he's supposed to do from an exhaustive, definitive perspective, right? So, which is quite irresponsible, I think, with the mystics that appear in the Talmud. You bring down a concept, and that people are going to go wild with this idea. There's going to be splits in the Jewish community because of it. I mean, there's going to be people unalived because of it. I mean, look
It's
what
Jewish
happened with
history, though.
Shabtai Tzvi, right? Uh, and that not only goes for Mashiach, but it goes like for the resurrection of the dead, and basically any other idea that gave birth to any other offshoot in Judaism. So in Sefer HaMitzvot, like the Rambam writes, that the command we have to believe in a Messiah is Deuteronomy the end of chapter 17, Parshat Shoftim, I believe, that talks about the command we have to establish a king if we want a king. Now, the Rambam doesn't understand it like that. He says that there's an obligation to have a king, even though we know the whole story with Samuel telling them, you don't want a king, you don't need a king, God will be your king. But he says, no, no. I mean, he just said that because they wanted a king for the wrong reasons, whatever. So the Rambam says that the idea of believing in a Messiah is merely believing in a king, but not just any king, a righteous king like David that would come from his line and through Solomon. But according to Maimonides, this is not a Superman. This is a man who will eventually die, just like everyone dies. His son will take over, and his kingship is not necessarily perpetual, right? I mean, God's not going to give us.
Right. So this idea, though, of a warrior king that fights these battles and leads and retakes Jerusalem and all this stuff, these are directly contradicting the vast majority of rabbinic writings from the earliest times that we have them, midrashim that exist from the earliest times of the Talmudic era, which was obviously something that was believed across the board by Jews at the time, which is Christianity, has its foundations in that belief, and the early era of midrashic literature doesn't disagree with those theological claims about the Messiah. In early midrashic text, the Messiah is a suffering Messiah who was existent at the time of creation, who is divine. So there is
Well, I don't think there was a consensus on that, but yes, there's many people who believe. But a lot of these midrashic ideas are post-Talmudic. I mean, most midrashim are post-Talmud, even though,
Midrash Rabbah and stuff like that is right alongside
yeah.
the Talmud with the same
So it's
people
pseudo
writing.
picker essentially, right? Well, so midrash Rabbah is who? I mean, they're the midrashim of Rabbah. So I mean, Rabbah wasn't like a Tana. That means that you're already talking about people who existed in Babylon.
No, it's people
Uh,
that are alongside the Talmud, um, Rabbanim of the Talmud era
no,
are
correct.
also in the Midrash.
No, yes, yes, yeah. But the Talmud is two books in one. The first part is Tanaim, which are the rabbis who lived in Israel when there was a temple and there was a court. And then in the case of
Right.
the Babylonian Talmud, you're talking about like rabbis in the 5th and 6th century, completely detached from what happened 200 years before
Well,
in Babylon.
compiled in the fourth, fifth, but starting around the second century, right?
We're not we're not in the Babylonian time. I mean, it's true that there were always Jews in Babylon, but the rabbis in Babylon, with the exception of Hillel, Hillel actually came from Babylon. So yes, there were Jews in Babylon, but the rabbis that appear in the Babylonian Talmud are the Amoraim, people who were detached 200, 300 years from like Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, right? There's the Jerusalem Talmud that has rabbis from Israel commenting on the Mishnah when they didn't have smicha. But the rabbis in the Babylonian Talmud didn't have smicha. They didn't live when there was a temple. They never met any of the rabbis. Well, there was one or two rabbis
I
in
mean,
Babylon who
it's
went and got smicha.
the problem
Yeah.
here with because the problem here with that um, continuation of reasoning is that you're invalidating the rabbinic authority claims that you're standing on, because that's an unbroken tradition. It might
Oh
not be
no.
samicha
Oh,
like in
so I
the
don't believe in that. Because I don't believe in this unbroken tradition thing post the Sanhedrin. I don't view a statement that a a a Rav or a teacher in Babylon makes up, right? That's not linked to the Mishnah. I don't view that as authoritative. Like I believe that the rabbinic tradition extended to the end of the Sanhedrin. And then once the Sanhedrin was dismantled, and then the Gemara, like the age of the Amoraim, appeared, they were just commenting on the Mishnah, trying to in some way make sense of what Rabbi Yehud Hanassi compiled, but not that they were the torch bearers of the rabbinic tradition.
So that brings me to another question. I mean, where do you then, for your belief system of what is the interpretation of Torah and how to fulfill it, it seems like it's whatever for you. It seems like the logical thing for you is the one that you take from any of the opinions. I mean, in the Talmud, Rabbi Hillel, like you said, says Ein Mashiach liyisrael shekvar chlu bizman Chizkiah, right? Or is it Chizkiah or Tzidkiah? I always get
Yeah, the Hiskiyahu.
right, Chizkiah. Right, it's Merat Tzidkiah. So they lost the chance for a Messiah. It came already in the time of
Hezekiah.
in Hezekiah the king. So it's not just that he says that and everyone's like, no, I disagree, I disagree. The other rabbis there literally go, excuse him, he's a fool, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Like that is obviously not what we
They
think
weren't in the
here.
same room, by the way.
No,
Right.
I
So
get it. It's a
it's very
baraita.
convenient. Yeah.
It's but the point is the consensus is that that is a foolish statement to make, and the Talmud ends with that opinion that that's a foolish statement. Um, like I know not everyone knows how rabbinic literature works, but like when you have the statement said and then the refutation and then the end, it's the refutation that holds value in most cases.
Oh, not necessarily. I mean, Rabbi Akiva is condemned for believing that the 10 lost tribes are not coming back, right? And I mean, this is Rabbi Akiva, actually. The Rabbi
The
Akiva
Roman
was
convert.
Rabbi Akiva was it? Well, his father was a convert, according to Maimonides, which, according to Jewish law, makes him a convert. I guess most people don't know that if your father's a convert, your status is still of a convert.
Well, biblically, it would be according to your father's lineage and where you're living. But
Right. So also like the whole two power controversy, I don't know if you ever studied that, was a
mm.
statement uttered by Rabbi Akiva who he was also condemned for. Right. So it seems like the victors write the history books. The idea that any of Rabbi Akiva's students would condemn him is is a bit absurd. And especially when these statements actually don't appear in the Mishnah. Well, they appear as brises in Talmud Yerushalmi. A brisa is essentially like a halachic medrash, meaning it might be pseudepigrapha because it's a story told about an individual, like let's say Rabbi Akiva, who would have existed in the time of the Mishnah, but the statement doesn't appear in the Mishnah, and for some reason it only exists in a place like Babylon, right? 200, 300 years detached, and in some way they bring it up to disagree with the Mishnah. So any statement that's a Bryce that's questionable, and the rabbis think they're questionable also, by simple fact that they don't accept them all. I mean, it's kind of like hadiths that are accepted and not accepted. But yeah, like I don't put too much weight on rabbis being checked by other rabbis in the Talmud, uh, especially when they're not in the same room, just because it's quite
well, how do
convenient.
you decide which is the legitimate way to follow a Torah commandment? Then,
Well,
how do
what do
you
you mean a
determine?
Torah?
I mean,
Like a
so how do you
what do you mean a
decide?
halakha?
Well, how do you decide how to put on tefillin, for example?
Oh, okay. So I'm pretty sure, like if you're convinced that like Moses didn't receive any other laws but the written law,
No,
that
I know where we agree on this and where it diverges, but
no, right.
like how do we, like, for explanation, how do we know how to put on tefillin,
So
and
there's a
why do you do
principle.
the ones that you do?
So there's a Mishnaic principle, Elu ve'elu, right? Elu ve'elu divrei chaim, that we believe that this and that are also the words of the living God. That's more like hyperbole. Um, the scenario that statement is uttered in, it's talking about Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. The splitting of the court was an initiative put forth by Rome to in some way split the vote and break unity amongst the Jewish people. What they're reminding us is that, I mean, similar to what appears in Matthew 23 for Christians listening, that these individuals, they sit in the seat of Moses. You have to do what they say. Following their instructions is equivalent to following God's instructions, Deuteronomy chapter 17, of not straying from the right to the left. So as long as you follow a ruling that came from the Sanhedrin, even though that Sanhedrin was split, because the idea that we go by Rabbi Akiva, or Beit Hillel over Beit Shammai doesn't appear in the Mishnah. That only appears in the Gemara
Right.
after by people who, so from a Mishnah perspective, if you were a student of Beit Shammai, follow Beit Shammai. If you're a student of Beit Hillel, do the same, right? That means as long as consensus basically started and ended with the Sanhedrin, the scholars of that generation or whatever, then you were okay, even though they differed in judgment because of the Zugot, because they split the court into two. That's the understanding. Now, the Amoraim are important because they help us. I mean, they have a clearer understanding to what the Tanaim actually meant because they even understood the language more than we do nowadays. So we use that as a valuable key to understand the Mishnah. But anything an Amara has to say about an issue, especially if it's not linked to like a Mishnah statement, is considered Agadah, and it's considered
So you
not
think that the Mishnah is the binding oral law?
absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. And
Even in the Mishnah, there's a lot of
oh, there's
ambiguities.
Agadah. I mean, Perka Avot is in the Mishnah, and it's not a like a sefer on halacha, right? So it's the legal rulings as they appear in the Mishnah that are binding. And truth be told, I would say that probably around 70% of Judaism today is not Mishnaic. Now, I think that but the understanding is that rabbis in our communities have the authority that we give them. So if someone, I don't know, like lived in Brisk or they lived in Poland, right, and their community like gave the power to one individual and they instituted practices and customs, the danger of that is um unless you keep on reinforcing the principles that we make a distinction between Torah law, Mishnaic law, and just customs, people start lumping them in together, and then you end up with the Judaism we have today. That Siddur is huge. It takes 5 hours to go through a Yom Kippur service because no one wants to take anything out
Well, I mean,
when around
if
seven.
you're gonna replace the temple sacrifices with a prayer, it better be a long one, right?
Yeah, so that's also like a medrash because prayers did exist during the Second Temple. I mean, synagogues existed even in Babylon.
Prayer always existed. I mean, that's very
Right,
clear in
correct,
Jewish
correct.
for sure.
No, right. I mean,
But
formalized prayer,
being a
like in halacha.
replacing the sacrifices with a prayer starts in 70 A.D. with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, with the changes in Yavne, with the new moon changes and the festival changes, and prayer replacing the sacrifice because no more temple. What are you going to do,
Yeah,
right?
but I don't think they replaced it. I mean, they gave you something to do.
Right.
I mean, you didn't fulfill your
Well,
obligation, by
2,000.
bringing a korban
So that's
tamid.
an interesting question. 2,000 years without a temple. What's going on, right? Is prayer enough to do that?
Oh
I
no,
mean,
no.
Tuvia Singer says yes. I know you probably say no, but
All right, so uh, well, he quotes the prophet Hosea, which is, I mean, not it's not authoritative in my book, but
right.
I mean, saying that we're going to offer the fruits of our lips doesn't mean that he's establishing a new clause that if you're not able to keep a commandment in the Torah in this manner, you could create another manner, like in a way to keep it, right? I mean, that's not what he's saying. It's complete poetry. Um, like when we say prayer, like in Orthodox Judaism, we strictly mean the Amidah, or the Shemona Esrei. So that is essentially what's created by the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, but there's different renditions of where prayer came from, right? I'm pretty sure, like, you're familiar with the notion that Abraham invented Shacharis and like Yitzhak Mincha and Yaakov Mariv, right? There's so many midrashim tied to it. Where the idea is one, where that prayer is not in the Torah. I mean, there's a debate between the Ramban and the Rambam, right? I mean, the Rambam says it's avodat halev, like the service of the heart is in some way tied to a statement, not just in
Like
Tehillim, but in
David
the
praying
Torah
for the
also.
life of his son, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, but that itself is not in the Torah either. And then Nachmanides
No,
disagrees. Fine,
that's in the
but the idea that prayer in some way fulfill like it doesn't work like that. If God told you you had to sacrifice, you have to sacrifice. And if you can't do it because you don't have a temple, well, then we're not liable for not doing it because we're not able to do it properly. But the idea that we don't have to do it anymore because we have prayer, no rabbi has the authority to in some way
So you do believe
add
that
to the Torah.
there's a biblical injunction to restore the temple
Oh, for sure, with the Mishkan. In
in a form or another,
correct. Even I mean during the second temple, but there wasn't an ark, and they still built the temple.
right?
So they felt some imperative to build essentially a Mishkan. What's a temple but a Mishkan with a stone base? Um, right, and to offer sacrifices and build the Mizbeach as well. So the idea that anything, or I mean, it's even sillier to think that going to a Yom Kippur service actually fulfills the Torah obligation, like for Yom Kippur, like a Yom Kippurim. It's absurd. It's yes, it's rabbinic. Yes, we have to do it because the sages or the men of the Sanhedrin instituted it, but that doesn't mean that it's overriding a Torah law. And in some way, when we rebuild a temple, we can in some way forego sacrifices just for prayer. I mean, that's for sure adding to the Torah.
So we have, taking it back there, Mishnah is the really the binding oral law as far as you
Right.
see it. If it's in the Mishnah, it's pretty conclusive. And then the
Correct.
Gemara is just your how you elaborate on that and understand what they're
Commentary.
saying. So some of those commentaries get a little bit out of hand, and I know that people say, well, it's agada, it's metaphorical a lot of the time. It's stories, it's allegories, but sometimes it does fall into genuine. It falls into how we actually interpret law, and it's based on some wacky things sometimes. And some of those things maintain their stance in modern Judaism through halacha. So you have things like obviously that are less important. Like there's a passage about, I honestly think, and Rabbi Emanuel Shochet I think pointed this out in a letter that he wrote about um, the rabbis of the Talmud engaged in dishonest polemics against each other. Um, so I think that there's a lot of sarcasm. There's a lot of like dismissal of the point. Not wanting to address things. So when one rabbi says, what's the difference between a male and female hyena in this circumstance here with paying damages?" And it's a practical law, right? It's about how you pay your neighbor damages if your animal damages his property, right? Well, the difference between the male and the female hyena is that the one of them, I think it's the male hyena, after 7 years turns into a arpad, into a bat, and then into another kind of bat, and then into a thistle, into a thorn, and then into a tree, and then into a demon. Um, right? And this is how they're addressing whether or not you pay the damages fully for that animal if you own one and it damages somebody else's property. Now, that's never going to happen. Nobody's going to have a hyena that damages their neighbor's property and be if you own a hyena, you're not getting into that debate about who's liable for the damages. But in more practical things, Brit Milah, for example, we have a little section of a debate in the Mishnah and in the Talmud about sucking the blood from the wound, right? And this seems to be the thorn in the side of everyone I talk to when I bring it up, and it's like, let's not talk about that one. I don't condone that, and it's like,
Right.
right. So it's sucking the blood from the wound of the baby's circumcision wound, right? And now they said it's not even about whether or not that's part of fulfilling the law. It's about a safety thing, right? Because they were archaic peoples that thought that was necessary to. So I wouldn't say that rabbis from the Talmud saying this were perverts or disgusting or whatever else it is. It's the archaic science of the time, right? Yet we call these people great sages, smarter than people today. But th- I mean, that's debunked, right? We know that's not the case, and yet it is still a mandatory part of the circumcision, to the extent that
We're not with the mouth anymore. I mean, it's
right.
there,
So, but I mean,
but they use a syringe.
so they use a tube, a glass tube in Orthodox circles. Even Reform rabbis use a glass tube to suck some of the blood out without making contact of the baby's blood to the mole's mouth, or from the mole's mouth to the baby's wound. But they're doing this to uphold this tradition that is rabbinic, that's insane, and that is consensus, right? That's across the board, right? The entire Jewish world believes you have to do it for it to be a kosher circumcision. They
Well, I
they
don't think
won't
it's so
say
absurd, by
they
the
won't say
way.
retroactively if you didn't do it that it invalidates it. They won't go that far to tell somebody they have to do another circumcision.
Mhm.
Um, so I mean, how do you explain that is consensus view? And I remember last time we spoke, you spoke to the importance of consensus, which is why you think there is a validity to waiting between milk and meat and so on. Um, why do we trust consensus on something that we know is absurd in your view?
So Maimonides specifically says that any type of medical advice given over by men of the Sanhedrin is essentially disposable if it goes against what mumchim, what experts in your generation say regarding medical advice. Um, Regarding this, what I heard in terms of matzitza bepeh is that it helps coagulate the blood in that area, and they even put spices on top of it, which I mean doesn't make it worse for sure. The spread of herpes, if people use their mouth, is problematic, right? And that for sure
I
shouldn't
mean,
be
it's
done.
not just that. I mean, it's not
What is
just the risk of disease. I mean, it's the act itself. If there isn't a
okay?
medical necessity, is a perverse act, right?
Well, okay. So I mean, it's only perverse if there's some sort of perverse intention. I understand in terms of
I disagree with
optics.
that, but yeah, I get what you're saying.
Oh yeah, right. No, in terms of optics, from an outsider's perspective, it may look like that, but it's not in the mind. It's not necessarily in the mind. I mean, how many circumcisions, like what do Moyles do a year to get their kicks off? If that was the case, all right. I truly wish that there's another Sanhedrin that could modify such a law. Um, and perhaps that we could come to some newer consensus, not to change the law, but to in some way explain it in a different manner, like the syringe, for example. Right? I mean, as a
But
matter of fact,
why
most circum.
why even that's my point. Even if you take the element of the act itself as perverse, right? Even if you draw blood with a syringe, right? You're
Oh, but I don't
still
believe it's perverse.
no, even if
Yeah.
we dismiss that, right? But let's
Uh,
say you only do it with a syringe, the entire Jewish world goes to doing it with a syringe. You're still engaging in an act as halacha, as obligation,
yeah.
based on something that started from an absurd perspective, right? And
Why
this,
did it start from an absurd perspective?
like the idea that you're going to suck blood from the wound is gonna,
To help coagulate the blood. I
but that's
mean,
not true.
so I've heard it
I mean, it's one,
that
it's
it
not
was true.
true. It was about sucking out any something that could cause infection,
Uh-huh.
not about coagulating the blood. But both of those
No,
things are
obviously that
false.
term wasn't used, but with the
In fact,
Orthodox
it can make the
rabbis,
bleeding worse in most cases. But yeah,
so I've heard something else. I mean, like I'm open to changing my mind if it actually makes it worse for sure. With the threat of herpes, doing it directly with your mouth could definitely make it worse. This is why the rabbis introduce a syringe. For some reason, if it's absolutely useless and it doesn't make it worse, I think it should still be done. Because that's how the Sanhedrin told us to do it. I mean, assuming they
it's not the
had good
Sanhedrin
intentions.
though.
I'm sorry.
It's not the Sanhedrin though. It's the Babylonian Talmud on Mesachet Shabbat.
Yeah, but every Gemara is commenting on a statement in the Sanhedrin. I'm sorry. Yes, I mean in the Mishnah. So it could be. You're right. If it only appears in the Babylonian Talmud as a
It's
concept
very unclear in the
developed,
Mishnah. It's a little more clear in the Talmud. But
right? Okay. So like if it appears in the Mishnah and the rabbis in the Talmud are explaining it, I'm curious how they explained it. If they actually developed the idea on their own, then that idea is not binding.
it
Okay.
comes.
But if they
It's actually extrapolated on to the point that we have it a little bit later even. Um, and then you have it in like the Harachamans about if you didn't do these three things, it's not a valid. He's
well,
not a
that's
valid moel.
secondary.
And but the
I,
point is
this is an
why are
interesting
we doing
point.
something as consensus that
Uh-huh.
started from a false it's not from a biblical law. We're saying that it's in order to fulfill this biblical law, you have to do it this way. But the thing is not about whether or not it's law or not. It's about whether it's safe or not. So it should be invalidated as fulfilling the biblical law anyways. It should be up to personal choice at that point. Do you want to take this medical advice or not take this medical advice? And then beyond that, if we know that it started from something that is medically false and the only justification is that it's medically necessary, then why do it at all, even symbolically?
Mhm. That's interesting. Like if the
Especially
actual
with the
rabbis in the
optics being so
Mishnah.
bad, right?
Well, I mean, if the rabbis in the Mishnah didn't mention the idea and it's strictly only mentioned in the Babylonian Talmud, well, then I would say it should fall off. I mean, the idea, like the practice, like should not exist. If it's in the Mishnah and it doesn't harm the child, and it's actually tied to an actual mitzvah, I believe that it must stand. Now, there's some things, like for example, um, I think um, twice in the Talmud it talks about combining two types of food or like not combining two types of food because it's a sakana. It's like a harm to your life, i.e., one is not eating dairy with fish, another one is not eating fish with meat,
I
and
mean,
then there's
that's
many.
another one. I mean, the not eating dairy with fish is Yosef Karo is writing that Hilchot Basar B'chalav, like you don't do these things together because of the biblical prohibition. On top of that, don't eat fish with milk. In addition to not eating meat with milk, the fish with milk is mishum sakana. But then it's
Mhm.
corrected later on, and he says this is not about sakana for fish and milk. It's sakana because it's fish. Fish and meat is sakana. But there are whole sections of the Jewish world that don't eat fish and milk together because it must be Ruach HaKodesh that Rabbi Yosef Karo said it in the first time. Therefore, we still do it, even though he corrected himself, which
So
is
the
to me
distinction
is
I'm making.
mind-boggling.
So I'm not even including like Joseph Caro because he's like much more recent. But that example is a practice that many people keep today that's not tied to an actual Torah law. There's a distinction between rabbinic laws and practices for their own sake, mentioned by either the Sanhedrin and hopefully not the Babylonian Talmud, then it can't even enter this discussion, that could fall away if for some reason the reason that they were created no longer applies. However, any law, any rabbinic law that's tied to an actual mitzvah could never fall away. Um, an example is the 39 melachot. Throughout Jewish history, the consensus was this is how you kept and possibly violated the Sabbath, right? That means the court would adjudicate people on the basis on whether they broke 39 laws or not. That means when the judges in some way filled the gap on how you keep an actual Torah law, that just can't change with another Sanhedrin. The only laws that another Sanhedrin could do away with or could fall away when they no longer apply, if the reason that they were created no longer applies, are laws not connected to Torah laws. Like, for example, establishing the new month. When it's so concrete and such a part of the basis of your religion, it could never change by another Sanhedrin, because then you'd be redefining how you do Judaism every 70 years, essentially. So that's a distinction why I believe that Metzitza B'Peh is still done and will continue to be done, but not just Metzitza B'Peh, with the notion of like agunot, and I guess agunim, for Ashkenazim who can't get married because they prohibit polygamy. It still has to, in some way, stay in place till perhaps another Sanhedrin could elucidate on how it can be done differently without violating the laws of marriage that are tied to to the biblical concept of marriage. Once a rabbinic law is tied to a biblical concept, it's hard for us to say, well, this rabbinic law should no longer stand because the reason no longer exists when it's trying to define an actual mitzvah for the nation.
Right.
I mean, that's a distinction like between Rav Yosef Karo or Sephardim not eating dairy with like fish or fish with meat.
Well, I still think that the if we're going to make the claim, we have a really big problem here, okay? Because if you're going to make the claim that consensus is important, right? Consensus across the Jewish world, and then the Jewish world has consensus on something like, for example, you're talking about meat and milk, right? The way that you keep it with a division that you say is valid to have as tradition that we keep doing this, that's nowhere in the Mishnah, right? But you'll tell people that it's waiting. I mean, not only is it not binding from the Mishnah, right? You'll have people violating biblical injunctions about, let's say, loving your neighbor over a rabbinical command of how long somebody waited after eating meat before they ate milk or chicken.
Oh, no, I'm not endorsing a separation in terms of time between meat and milk. It's true, the Mishnah nor the Gemara gives you a time. However, in terms of a sakana, that it's dangerous to eat fish with dairy or like fish with meat, that itself is not even tied to a biblical command.
Right.
I mean, like
right. We can agree that that's absurd. I mean, for sure. But even from the Basar B'chalav actual, the halachot related directly to it, excuse me, the Mishnaic version of it is don't eat them together. And yet you have people insane about like how many hours they waited afterwards to the minute. Like, how is, if that's not from the Mishnah, why is that kept at all in your opinion? Or why is it valid, rather? Because we know why it's kept.
Yeah,
I mean,
so
we keep a lot of
I don't
crazy
think it
traditions.
should be kept. So, like the Mishnah never talks about how long. It says that there should be some sort of division. So some people concluded that all you have to do was rinse your mouth out, brush your teeth. The Rambam says, it says kamoshesh, around 6 hours. That wasn't the consensus even at that time, because Ashkenazim, I think even to today, like Yekes wait 3 hours, Dutch Jews wait 1 hour. Like the Ramah said to wait 1 hour. But I think because of the Rambam's influence on Shulchan Aruch, I mean, Shulchan Aruch also says 6 hours. Everybody waits, 6 hours, but the Talmud never gives a time period. So that's the difference between how I understand Jewish law and how other people understand Jewish law. They incorporate customs, which are, I think, important. I mean, I don't think they necessarily have to be tossed out, but we have to make a distinction between what's actual halacha and what's just a minhag. So waiting the 6 hours, 1 hour, 3 hour are just minhagim.
But all halachot that we have today started out as minhagim also.
No. What do you mean?
I
I mean,
mean,
there's some.
waiting at all. I mean, from after eating meat before eating
Oh,
milk
so the way.
is for sure a
Okay,
minhag at some point that became a
so
halacha, right?
orthodoxy.
All of these are customs that became laws.
Well, the reason I have an issue with it is because there's a different category for minhagim, like the Rambam calls it minhagot, when it comes to the Sanhedrin, because there's something called a gezerah and a takana. So, I mean, a
Right.
gezerah is clearly not a minhag. I mean, maybe it could have started out because of it, but not necessarily. So, a gezerah is it's a negative rabbinic command. The takana is a positive rabbinic command, and then we have minhagim, which yes could have started off as some cultural practice, but then it became ratified and made into law by the Sanhedrin. So some minhagim, right? I mean, there's a statement like minhag Yisrael Torachi, right? But these are minhagim that are in some way ratified by the Sanhedrin. So I wouldn't say that every takana, right? I mean, sometimes you have case law that builds halacha. I wouldn't say that's necessarily from a minhag, but there's some minhagim that did become laws. Yeah.
Okay. So first, I want to address this here quickly in the comments. This guy gives me a kick, and every time I see his comments, I get hungry because I think prime rib.
What does that mean?
Yeah, I'm a very reasonable person. I just don't like when people are intellectually dishonest. That really grinds
Right.
my gears. So I'm
Well,
actually a very reasonable person. I don't fight with anyone in real life or face to face, only in YouTube comments. Um, so the thing is, though, so my problem is this: we have a tradition that become. It's literally like the song that never ends. You ever heard that one? This is the song that never ends. It goes on.
yeah.
Some people started singing it not knowing what it was, and they'll continue singing it forever just because it's the song that never ends. It's like that's to me what a lot of these halachot are. It's literally just the song that never ends. Somebody's going to add a thing, somebody's going to add a thing, and it just becomes like if you don't have the right fur in your hat, now you're not part of the
No, I hear
community
you.
anymore. And it's like, but all of halachot started that way because I agree that the tradition of interpreting Torah law has to have gone back to Moses.
Yeah,
That I
because
will
my
never disagree
perspective,
with.
like my
There,
perspective should really be a breath of fresh air for you then, that I'm limiting rabbinic authority to the rabbis in the Mishnah, which is probably less than 70%, right? That we've added around 70% of what we call Judaism today outside of what appears in the Mishnah. That means if you went through the Mishnah, even a commentary that you would use Kahati, Bartanura, the Rambam, whatever, like on the Mishnah, and lived your Judaism like that, which would have been the Judaism that Rabbi Akiva lived, you would have so much more time to proselytize or ride motorcycles or on a live terrace. Right? It's the all-encompassing, chokehold that the rabbis have on the Orthodox world that bothers you because they don't have the authority to do this, right? But they
I mean,
still do.
it's all well and good that you have this style, and I think that, like I said last time, I might disagree with you wholeheartedly on certain philosophical elements, but I think practically you have a much better Judaism than what I've ever seen in the Orthodox world that I grew up in, right? To an extent, I mean, there are some things that I would say that the fundamentalist view does a little bit better, um, which I think you're also at risk of with the how do I put it? With the arbitrary nature of how you're choosing which ones to follow. I mean, you can very easily have people just fall away from it in general unless they just like it, right? Which is, I guess,
Well,
something that
not
you're
from a
advocating
Mishnah
for,
perspective. I mean, if it's written in the Mishnah and you try to express it, I mean, you're still trying to keep it if you still feel bound to it. I think people are more likely to drop it when they start drowning in so many irrational laws that have no roots.
right?
I mean, you
So,
agree that we need consensus. We can't move forward as a nation without
so,
consensus.
so if the consensus though is that, right, this is, I guess, a problem for you, right? If the consensus is that, let's say, that you do have to keep a certain tradition from a certain rabbi from a certain time, because the consensus is your rabbi, right? Asay l'charav, like your rabbi does have authority to
Oh, I don't
bind,
believe in that.
right? But you don't believe in that, but that's the consensus. So how can you, from one side, say we
No,
need
no,
the
no.
Jewish consensus, but I don't want to follow the consensus with the thing that I don't like because I don't agree with it? I mean,
So when
logically,
I
you could
say
be true, but
consensus,
you're disagreeing with the consensus,
So when I say consensus, I don't mean the consensus of Jews today. The vast majority of Jews aren't even religious today. Perhaps you should all become atheists. Then in America, I believe 54% of born Jews identify as atheists. Consensus, I mean the authority of the Sanhedrin. That's the only authoritative consensus in the Jewish world. In terms of a Selech Harav, Pirkei Avot is not a halacha sefer. I mean, it tells you to make one rabbi like it tells you to make one friend. No, learn from someone. Like have many friends. That's the idea, not how they misunderstand it in the Haredi world that you can't blow your nose without some rabbi's permission. The consensus, what's known as rove, the majority, is always what the majority of the Sanhedrin ruled, the Sanhedrin, not the rabbis today. From that perspective, we have consensus, right? That's ancient, that's grounded, at least, I mean, closer to Moses than we were, right? And then we have the free time, right? I mean, because it's quite minimal. You're talking about 20% of what we do today is really Mishnaic in nature, and it's grounded. I mean,
But at the end of
you
the
know,
day, what you're giving here, aside from the Mishnah, because there is so much in the Jewish community, even by how you live, right? There
mhm.
must be things that you do as minhag, not as halacha,
Oh, for
right?
sure, for sure.
But you're so far removed from the Tanakh in that sense that everything is an opinion at the end of the day. And what's the difference then if you can't give a grounding of not just pragmatically valuable, but also authentically true from an objective standpoint? Why does somebody who is authentically looking for? I confronted a Freemason about this not long ago because they're saying we have a code of morals and ethics, and I go, but you don't have anything objective to point it to. How can the Muslim, the Jew, and the Christian, and the Hindu and the Buddhist in your Masonic lodge all agree on the objective standard of morality? It's a farce. I mean, you can't say that they
But they pray
agree.
to the Bible, by the way. I
They're
mean, I'm
all
actually a Freemason,
right,
surprisingly. Yeah, yeah. But I mean, the centerpiece of any lodge
unless it's a
is
Muslim that's swearing on a Quran or a Hindu that's swearing on the Bhagavad Gita, not swearing, but like doing the ceremonies with, right?
that's so. Those are more like clandestine lodges, like free and accepted Masons, at least traditional ones, like still make you swear on the Bible. And some of them exclude. Now there's this idea that as long as you believe in some central power, you don't even have to believe in God. They let you in. But there's some lodges that
But the
accept
Buddhist
women.
doesn't believe in God, which is,
Correct. Yeah. So he traditionally would not have been accepted. But this whole notion that you just have to believe in some like in some power, some force is a neo-Masonic idea. I mean, it doesn't have roots like for sure past 20 years ago.
I mean,
Right?
but the,
It's
the Masons have a one up on the Jews there because to be a Jewish person, you don't have to have a belief in God either at all. You just have to do the things, right? And then you're part of the community. It's a pragmatic.
that's
The the image that you're giving is a valuable pragmatic lifestyle,
mhm,
but it's not necessarily. You still haven't given me anything that points to this is why we should believe that God, as He has revealed His law in the
mhm.
Torah, would want you to wait 6 hours after eating meat before eating milk. There's
Yeah.
no
Well, the six
consistent
hours is secondary. I
uh,
mean, that
or
does
or
not
waiting,
apply.
but I'm saying there's no consistent train of thought there. At some point, it's just somebody said so, so we do it,
Oh no,
right?
no. Well, I mean, for sure that we can't pull the rug up like from under us, right? I mean, the Torah is the foundation, right? That we believe that
But the Torah
that
also says bring sacrifices in a temple. So what are we
no,
doing sitting
right, when
around,
you're
right?
able to. When you're able to, like if you don't have a temple, you're actually prohibited from building an altar outside of the place that God chose. Just like you don't have to I don't know, like have a mezuzah, like if you live in a car, right? So I mean, there's a certain way to keep the mitzvah, but if you can't keep it in the right manner, that means you're not allowed to keep it in any way, at least regarding sacrifices. But the role of the court, I believe, in terms of consensus, appears in Deuteronomy chapter 17, that on all matters of dispute, we have to go to the place that God chooses, and they'll give you the verdict. Now, I know that it takes a certain level of faith to believe that the rabbis that appear in the Mishnah are in line with these rabbis, but for the sake of consensus, if these guys didn't exist, then we would have invented them because Israel can't move forward without some sort of uniform effort to progress.
Okay. So so then as to how so the consensus view though is like this is very important because if we're understanding the progression, you're saying the Sanhedrin still exists up until the Tanaic period, right? There is still value in what the Tanaim are saying. The Mishnah is binding in that way. So here's a problem that I have, and maybe you can address it. 70 CE, right?
Mhm,
Yochanan ben Zakkai, according to rabbinic literature, this is not a polemic against Judaism.
mhm.
There's hundreds of different schools of rabbinic Judaism called Pharisees at the time, Prushim. There's hundreds of different ones that all follow different leadership.
Let's just say
Wh-
we're seven. I mean, according to the Talmud, I don't believe every rabbinic Jew
I
of
mean,
that time was a
historically,
Pharisee.
that's absurd claim, but I mean, there are so many
Well,
different groups that
well,
were
in the
cited
Talmud,
to.
not one rabbi ever identified as a Pharisee, but they actually make fun of the Pharisees in the Talmud.
So the thing is, though, there are tons of different schools of thought at the time in competing viewpoints, right? The fact that there are in the one that exists today multiple competing viewpoints is just indicative of the fact that we don't necessarily know. There has to be a consensus, discussion to come to conclusions. But what happens in 70 is the temple is destroyed. Yochanan ben Zakkai, with a political deal with the Emperor Vespasian, spares that school, which moves to Yavne, because Jews are not allowed in Jerusalem after that. Um, and that's rabbinical Judaism, is that one school. What was the consensus viewpoint between the other groups at the time that were wiped out, though?
What other groups? I mean, he said, I mean, to save Yavne for the Chachamim. So he meant Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai sat on the Sanhedrin
Right.
along with all the other rabbis in Yerushalayim. He was part of the Beit Din Hagadol. But the understanding is that
No, the
every
Sanhedrin included different Prushim groups, and it
within the
included
Sanhedrin.
Tzedukim,
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah,
mostly
but
mostly Tzedukim.
no, well, okay, not most. It says that there was a time that there was a Sanhedrin just full of like Sadducees for sure. But to
Right.
say that they were majority, I mean, there's no source in terms that they were the majority. But as a matter of fact, like I'm not of the opinion that Sadducees didn't believe in the oral law. I believe that they were the foundation, like from a certain perspective, because they sat on the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin is the source of the oral law according to rabbinic Judaism. So I mean, it's a more of a Christian idea that they didn't believe in the oral law. What they didn't believe in was the sayings of the fathers, which is essentially what we call midrash and agadah. But what he was securing for himself was the Sanhedrin for the Chachamim, which would have included Sadducees, Pharisees.
Right.
You know, like
So
I don't think.
half of the Sanhedrin at least
Uh-huh.
was wiped out in the destruction of Jerusalem.
Oh, that no, the Sanhedrin didn't pass their authority down from like father to son. It was transferable. One person
Right,
could give
but
20 people seifa.
the consensus group that was to determine the laws at the time was vastly diminished and wiped out. It was
How do you know?
specific because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai moved specifically that school of rabbinical thought to Yavne as the leadership.
I
That's what
think Rabbi
happened
Yochanan ben
historically.
Zakkai
The rest were
was
wiped out. It was spare the students. It doesn't say spare all the Prushim. It doesn't
no,
say spare all the rabbis. It says spare the students of Rabbi Gamliel.
no. It says the Chachamim.
The
I
students
mean,
of
the
Rabbi
phrase
Gamliel.
is like, I mean, to save Yavne for the Chachamim. In terms of a specific school,
It was the students of Rabbi Gamliel that were spared in the
no, no.
destruction
In
of
terms
Jerusalem.
of okay, yes, well, there were different schools, but the Sanhedrin had the authority to bring that. It brought down the scholars of the era who had this
Right.
in faith. We believe this notion that they had smicha, and then they would vote things into existence. Whether half that school ever, that whether the students of Shammai were done away with and there only existed the student of Hillel, it was still left up to vote.
Right, but as you mentioned, the victors write the history, right?
No, that's fine, but why would you assume that one disliked the other, or they brought in, I don't know, personal agenda when trying to understand Jewish law from a practical perspective? I mean, as a matter of fact, there isn't a source that teaches that the Sanhedrin ever became corrupted. The priesthood, yes, but the Sanhedrin, no.
I mean, the
I
priesthood was
mean,
incredibly corrupted, um, and they were the majority of the Sanhedrin. I mean,
no.
that
So
was I mean that was the necessity from Roman law. The appointed corrupt temple priesthood, which was allowed to exist because the Romans allowed it to exist because they were in charge. They were the majority. They had to be the majority.
yeah, but not in the Sanhedrin. Here, look, with the Nasi always had to be the Kohen Gadol. However, when the priesthood became corrupted, the members of the Sanhedrin replaced it with a member of King David. And this is like when Hillel stepped in, because they had a placeholder with Shemaiah of Talion. And then when Hillel came in, they say because that he's from David, the understanding is that in place of the high priest, he steps in. So even the members of the Sanhedrin threw the corrupt priest, I mean, according to our tradition, threw the corrupt priest out of the Sanhedrin. I'm not saying that Kohanim in general couldn't have been there. Anyone could be a Kohen. Like, you don't have to be an active priest. I mean, to be considered a Kohen. But the idea that the majority were Sadducees or the majority were like part of the priestly class, I don't see a source for that. I mean, at least, I mean, do we even know one 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 Tana? Or I mean, how many Tanaim are known as like something a Cohen? I mean, it's a quite Well, it's quite rare, essentially. I mean, if the majority were priests, I mean, you
from
figure
from
it'd be
the
this a Cohen,
from
that a
the
Cohen.
the history of the time and from corroboration from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's school itself, it was specifically the students of Rabbi Gamliel that were spared. Meaning,
No, that's fine.
the
That's fine.
Sadducees for sure were wiped out. The temple was any temple related was gone, which means at least half of the Sanhedrin at the time, because that was the Roman requirement. It couldn't have been less than half temple cult. Um, but even amongst the different schools of thought, there were obviously different belief systems. There's arguments, even within that school. There's arguments. There was definitely between different schools arguments, but only one is preserved. So
Well,
when
this
we
phrase
talk
doesn't
about
appear in the Talmud, though.
consensus, but when
Hold
we're
on.
talk, but when we're talking about consensus going back to Sinai, right? That there's a tradition that goes back that can help us, and that's why the Mishnah is binding, because it is that continuation. That's invalidated by the fact that the victors writing the history tell you what they want you to know about it, first of all. Um,
Yeah, but our literature, our like meaning Orthodox Jews, the Talmud itself never said that he only preserved the school. I mean, it just doesn't say that. I mean, he said like stam chachamim, with the idea that he in some way like had an interest in just preserving his teachers and his students might be true. It just doesn't appear in our literature like this. So we assume that at least those who sat together in the Sanhedrin had a certain level of respect, that they may have
I
viewed
don't think they
things
did. I think that's
philosophically.
historically. I think that's historically inaccurate. I think there
I mean,
was.
can you give me an example? I mean, even the students of Hillel and Shammai, I mean, still married into each other's family. I mean, there was still then later on, maybe later on, like after the destruction of this temple, where there may have been more of a rift, especially when the Amoraim chose Hillel over Shammai in terms of like who do we poskin by. But at the time of the temple, now yes, I get it. Like one of the things that caused the destruction of the temple was Sinat Hinam, but the notion that the rabbis in the Talmud disliked each other to in some way monopolize the final ruling, right? I mean, he only tried to save his own school. It just doesn't appear in the Talmud. It might be true. It just doesn't appear in the
It
Talmud like that.
specifically says the school of Rabbi Gamliel.
Well, let's
As
look it
far
up.
as
I
yeah,
mean,
I mean, we can look it up, but
mhm.
the fact is, even like what you say, even if it was afterwards, I mean, there's a broken line there where specific people decide what's being said and what's not said, which means the
it,
consensus view is corrupted
it
for
could be.
sure.
It could be. It could be. It's just not like that. Let's see. Hold on.
Yochanan. Yeah, it says,
It says
"Give me
leyavne levechachamim. Wait, hold on.
spare
Yeah,
the spare the dynasty of Rabbi Gamliel."
where?
Right
Where?
after that, it's in the same passage.
Hold on.
It's the sages of
It's in
Yavna, the
Gittin, right?
dynasty. It's the sages of Yavna, the dynasty of Rabbi Gamliel.
The say. No, it says Tana li Yavne, like give me Yavne, like for the Chachamim. I mean, it's in Gittin 56b.
Right, I'm looking at it here.
Yeah. Oh wait, hold on.
It says it right
Instead of
afterwards in the same
asking me,
passage.
oh, it says the
Greetings
family.
to you, greetings to the king. Vespasian said to him, liable for two.
No, the reason he said okay, so the Nasi, the time that was Rabban Gamliel,
Right.
like he was the head of the Sanhedrin, but it's not saying the students of Rabbi Gamliel, because like, everyone was under him, but his statement was that
No,
like to
that's the
save
thing. Not
Yavna for
everyone
the
was under him.
Chachamim.
There was other schools. There's the dynasty of Gamliel, but there's other schools. There
No,
are other groups.
no, I get it, but the Nasi was Gamliel. Like he was the head of the Sanhedrin. So by him saying to save Yavne for the Chachamim, he means the Chachamim, including the head of the court, which was the Rabbi Gamliel, like not the students of Rabbi Gamliel. Because he says to save it for the Chachamim, and then he says to save the family of Gamliel. Why? Because Gamliel is a direct descendant of David Melech, right? Because he's a descendant of Hillel. I mean, Hillel was placed there to replace the Kohen Gadol because he was from the line of David, and this is why the Nasi kept on being from the same family, but not because like I mean, specifically had a vested interest in just the students of Rabbi Gamliel.
This is an interesting comment here, by the way.
Uh-huh.
Moreover, Akiva was promoted as a response to Paul. So whatever historicity there is in that, there's an interesting anecdote, which is that there are a bunch of writings from around the end of the first century of early church fathers who are talking about apostles that were martyred for their faith. And immediately within 30 or 40 years, you start to see the writings of Rabbi Akiva, for example. Um, no, Rabbi Akiva's later. There are other ones earlier, and then Rabbi Akiva's even later, being martyred by the Romans and proclaiming the Shema as he's being martyred. It's just a really interesting
Yeah.
interesting
Akiva lived over 100 years after
historical
Paul, so
progression,
like it wouldn't have.
right? But it's just I don't know if it's historically connected or not, but it just seems funny that there's this suddenly a bunch of written legends about people being martyred and making declarations of faith, and then immediately afterwards it starts to enter rabbinic tradition as well. Um, no, Paul was definitely not a student of. No, Paul was a student of Gamaliel. He wasn't a student. Well, he claims he was a student of Gamaliel. That's up for the historical debate. I mean, the idea that Paul would be quoting Hebrew scriptures and have a knowledge of them to the extent that he did, even if you take the Jewish approach that he was perverting them, you'd have to have been a leader of a rabbinic school or some.
You think so? I mean, I think so.
Yeah,
Then it's
yeah,
like
because most people did not have that. Most
so
people were not able to quote scripture to say that he could quote scripture to that degree, to the point that he could pervert it exactly, cut things exactly as he wanted to, and then say that he wasn't actually a rabbi. I think that's a false dichotomy there.
mm. So I mean, it could be how
It's a
it is
weird claim to me.
nowadays.
He's either
Someone could learn in
if you want to claim that
yeshiva.
he's a heretical like liar about his lineage, but that he knows it to that degree, I think is absurd.
Yeah, I don't believe he's clearly like he's not an ignoramus, but only because you could quote scripture, and I don't know to what degree. I mean, that when you live and breathe Torah from that perspective, I mean, you live in the society. I mean, you get to quote out verses here and there accurately,
Right.
but to say that he was definitely a rabbi, maybe. I mean, it's like nowadays someone could learn in like in Or Sameach and claim to be a student of like the Rosh Hashiva, but there's hundreds of kids who work like who also learn there. So it's not necessarily like you know like by saying that you learned at the feet of someone, it, like could be hyperbole, but that you just like
Oops.
sat in on a share here or there.
Is this an admission that the Greek for all those texts existed prior to Christianity? Ruh-roh.
Hmm?
Oops. Well, if he was quoting the Greek for those passages from Isaiah, that means the Greek must have existed prior to Christianity, which means Christians couldn't have manipulated the text. But that's interesting. So the thing then is on the consensus viewpoint. I want to get back to that because I think this is a linchpin here. First of all, one of my issues, again, from an outside of the pragmatic value, is that if you're going to tell people this is the way to fulfill Torah, there has to be something true to point to. This is true about what God wants from us. If it's not true, then why are we doing it? If it's just pragmatic, if it just seems good, if it just is the best answer, if it's the best of the bunch, if it's the closest we could get, doesn't necessarily make it true. I mean, people have said if I have such a, if I have a, no, I know that's what I'm saying. I'm using that term. Like people ask me, like, if you're so charitable towards the Christian view over the Jewish view, to me, why aren't you a Christian? And it's a very good question. And it's not that I would never be a Christian. It's that at the moment, I can't just get close to the truth. You need to show me why it's true, right? Now, the debate might boil down to which kind of Christian at the end of the day, because that's a really big problem for Christians. But at the end of the day, that's what I'm bringing here is that why, how can you justify a stance that says we should do this because it's the good thing to do and the right thing to do because God said so in the Torah? We have a tradition that says to do this, but there may be these and these flaws, and we may be doing things like metzitza at the Brit because it's consensus about a medical opinion that one rabbi in the Talmud had.
So, like, if you fail to make a distinction between man-made law and Torah law, like I would see your point.
Like 90% of the Orthodox Jewish world, at least.
Right, correct. And I'm not in some way trying to justify what they do. If you constantly make a distinction between fallible, man-made law that is still sanctioned by God, and I don't believe God expects you to keep a halacha that violates the Torah. Sometimes it's a mitzvah to break a halacha from that perspective. Right? It says don't follow the majority to do evil. I think we should be
well, we do follow the majority to do evil.
No. I'm saying that we shouldn't.
But that is what the Orthodox Jewish world does.
Right,
right?
but I'm not in some way standing up for the Orthodox Jewish world as it's portrayed in Chabad or Satmar or like anyone else who I think misrepresents Judaism. I mean, according to this systematic theology that I'm laying down, whether we live up to its proper observance or not, you need a consensus. And we happen to have a consensus, at least one could include faith in this, that the rabbis that appear in the Mishnah claim to have this
Well, I want
powerful
to stop you there because
shlita.
I don't think that there is a systematic theology there. That was why I started with that, because you're not presenting truths about God, right, which would be a systematic theology. You're presenting truths about what makes the most sense that He wants from us,
Oh
right?
yeah, well, because I never said that I'm in any way trying to define what I do as truth, but perhaps as truer than another system. Regardless, what makes God God is that God's good. He gave us a standard that I believe has civilized the world for the most part. I believe the Torah is not the only book, but the main book to civilize this world. How do we keep this book in a uniform national manner? There has to be consensus, and that's what appeared in the Torah.
Well, it didn't
You have the
civilize
role
the
of the
it didn't civilize the world in the hands of Orthodox Jews. It civilized the world in the hands of Christians.
No, that's fine. I'm not endorsing modern Orthodox Jewry. I think they're doing it wrong. I think that the closer they get to the source, the more practical and purposeful their Judaism will look like. Right? I mean, I believe the rabbis in the Talmud also believed in proselytizing. I believe the rabbis in the Mishnah weren't as mystically inclined as the rabbis today. Not to mention that they weren't so preoccupied with law, meaning they did what they had to do, but they didn't have to encompass every aspect in their life with customs and practice and tradition that wasn't ruled upon by the Sanhedrin. Now Judaism is completely all encompassing, and I could see how people opt out of it because you know what? It's I mean, sometimes if you put the fence too high, then the plants don't grow. Right? I mean, tied to the notion that they're allowed to build fences. So I'm not in any way endorsing
Well,
modern day
it's a
orthodoxy.
circular claim because the claim that we can make fences is in the text that it's making the fences. So, I mean, there's
No,
also a
no.
problem there.
Well, in terms of decrees to in some way protect Torah laws, as long as they don't violate Torah laws, makes sense, right? And if it came from the Sanhedrin, why not? As long as we make a distinction, right? I mean, there's a whole section in the Talmud that talks about the errors of the Sanhedrin, and like in Masechet Torayot, the Sanhedrin makes errors. Even the Torah talks about the erroneous rulings of the priests, what sacrifice they have to bring. These are fallible men who are sanctioned from a higher authority. It's something that I think Christians and Muslims, like, it's hard for them to understand. For something to be binding from their perspective has to be strictly God sent and infallible. From our perspective, they're completely fallible, but for the sake of order, God wants us to listen to them for the most part, as long as they don't violate the Torah. And I'm just saying that system makes sense, and that's what I'm promoting. And you know, the closest thing that we have to this working is what occurs in the Mishnah. The the rulings that were codified in the Mishnah gives us some semblance of how Judaism was kept in a collective manner in a land called Israel. Right? I mean, if not, there would be no way to keep the Sabbath, right? In some
Well, do you think
objective
Jews
perspective.
have to keep it outside of Israel?
Not from a Torah perspective, they don't. In terms of there is no liability for breaking Torah laws
So
outside of the land of Israel.
where is the objective relationship between God and people in the giving of this law to humanity, right? Where you say it doesn't just apply to Jewish people, all people should want to be Jewish and convert, right? Or we should try to convert all people to Judaism, right? Because that's your stand. You do believe in proselytizing.
Sure, sure, for sure.
So where is this objective law of God that is true that would make somebody want to convert if it doesn't even apply outside of a specific um, geographic boundary?
Mhm. Again, I don't like using that word true. I offer this to people who already believe in the Bible. If somebody has fallen in love with the God of
No, for
Israel,
sure. Even people that believe in the Bible, though.
yeah, yeah. I believe if they fall in love with the God of Israel, they should obey the God of Israel. Whether there's a penalty for not obeying him, you should still obey them. I believe Jews should keep the Sabbath. Is there a punishment by the Sanhedrin? I mean, the Sanhedrin had no authority outside of the land of Israel. So I think that because we're awaiting redemption, in order to be on the same page, right? Because we have to in some way turn back to God in exile in order to be found worthy enough to be brought
You
back.
see, I want to stop you there because this comment illustrates it, right? The oral Torah is in the Hebrew Bible. It's in Nehemiah, right? In Nehemiah in Hebrew.
Okay.
For the Christian listeners, it's Nehemiah. For the Jewish listeners, it's Nehemiah. Um, the fact that there was a tradition on how to keep laws does not mean that the Mishnah or the oral Torah we have today is that tradition or the entirety of that tradition. Meaning the fact that there are obligations that go along with things that are cited as reference in things like Nehemiah. But if you're going to say that you can look to Nehemiah for inspiration as to how Jews did things, you can also look to the prophets then, and then you have a big problem because the prophets contradict that. Um, but that's obviously it's a fallacy here because the fact that there is a tradition doesn't mean that the tradition is the correct tradition, right? As I cited, there's been many times throughout history since Nehemiah that things had a chance, and in some cases very blatantly so, to be distorted, right? But that's what the Jewish world thinks. That's what the Orthodox Jewish world thinks, is that there's definitely a rabbinical tradition going back into the Torah itself, and it never got broken and it never got warped. To the fact that they'll say the Masoretic text written in the 10th century is the true, preserved, 100% authentic. Every crown on every letter is the one going back to Moses. They'll even say that Moses saw God writing those letters, but we know historically that it was a different alphabet even at the time.
Mhm.
So, like the idea that you're like, so this claim that the Sanhedrin even goes back into the time of David and so on. I mean, this is superimposed on the Tanakh by Talmudic literature. Never existed before that. There's no first century BC, second
But
century
there's
BC, third
courts.
century. There's nothing to illustrate in any way that there was a Sanhedrin like there was in the first century going
Well,
prior
there
to
was a
that.
court. Hold on. So there was a court. Perhaps it didn't have the name Sanhedrin.
But not
Uh,
a court of law, but not a court of determining tradition.
oh, I
That's
mean,
two very different things.
yeah. No, I never said that this court determines tradition. It only determines law. I mean, I guess now that we don't have a Sanhedrin anymore, we could call this whole notion as something traditionally Jewish. But at that time, there wasn't debate essentially. I mean, assuming you didn't have a split on the court, um, the court was in some way laid out in an odd fashion, not in an even fashion. So they could always come up with some final ruling. But I never used the word as absolutely true. No, I'm just saying that in order to keep the Torah that you've already accepted,
But then the whole idea, if that's not true, then the whole idea of the Mishnah being binding as a source of rabbinic law for how to fulfill the Torah falls apart completely
no,
because there's
I
no
mean, it doesn't
historicity
follow.
to that claim.
If from the beginning I said that it's a statement of faith, that if we didn't have the Mishnah, we would have to develop a Mishnah because there's most of the ceremonial laws cannot be kept without some consensus on how everyone's going to keep it, especially when there's a death penalty attached to some laws like the Sabbath. Like it tells you there's a death penalty like for violating the Sabbath, but it didn't get. I mean, tell you all the precepts of how one keeps or possibly breaks the Sabbath. It tells us to keep holidays. It never tells us how to establish a month,
No, it
at
does say
least
it.
not in
It
the
says if
Torah.
you light a fire in the public in on the Sabbath in the camp, then you get put to death for that,
It says in terms of there's a prohibition on kindling. There's a
right?
prohibition on picking up sticks. However, are
In
you
the
to believe
Torah,
that that's the? I'm sorry.
in the Torah, in the five books of Moses,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a prohibition of the man who picks up sticks, and then Moses goes back to the tent and
right?
inquires
So
of God
picking
of
up
what he should
sticks,
do.
lighting fires. What else? What else is
Mhm.
biblical? I mean, before we get to rabbinical tradition,
Uh, Not going outside of the place,
not going outside
like
of the camp, like
correct.
not
I
working,
mean,
whatever that means, right?
yeah. So there had to be some consensus on how this was in some way to be kept. I'm sure you acknowledge that the Sanhedrin had a part in developing that consensus. With the idea that someone could walk around with a Torah scroll under their arms determining how they were going to keep the Sabbath meant that by definition we wouldn't improve as a people. So I'm not in any way trying to say that I can prove that the rabbis that appear in the Mishnah
I mean, also
that have
the idea that from Moses got carried on with a tradition that's going to say this is how we do it, this is how we
no, I
worship
said
God,
faith.
but
I mean, from the beginning I said faith.
the entire Jewish people, basically Israelites and Judeans, and then what became Jews later on from the Southern Kingdom, right?
Mhm.
All along that way, they're worshiping idols, they're stoning the prophets to death. The kings are getting switched out one after the other. You're going to tell me that you think, from a faith basis, that the tradition of how to preserve those laws was kept without being corrupted?
Unless you have some source that says that the Sanhedrin became corrupted, which doesn't exist.
Well, we don't have a source that says there was a Sanhedrin at that time either, so there can't be a source that it became corrupted.
I mean, the New Testament itself talks about a Sanhedrin
First century, not fourth,
in that
fifth, sixth century BC. I'm talking about the whole time that Israel is before that, before the Babylonian exile, right?
So Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, well, not Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Hillel, Shammai, the bulk of these laws that the rabbis in the Gemara and the later, Tanaim are speaking on are rabbis who existed when there was a temple. And I mean, on top of the Temple Mount, they ruled. I mean, it's with the idea that a court existed throughout Israel and suddenly ceased to exist. I mean, like you'd have to in some way question everything we
So
read
those
about
same
them
so
going to
those same
Yalta and Babel.
rabbis that you're quoting as authority for how to interpret biblical law are also writing things like, which is funny because Tuvia Singer says that it's Israel um, in Isaiah 53, for example, but Rabbi Emmanuel Shochet wrote and said that's only used for polemics against Christianity. That's not the midrashic or Talmudic understanding of it. That it is a suffering Messiah who's going to die, and it's Mashiach ben Yosef, and so the whole thing like that. But also midrashic literature about the Messiah being pre-existent. These are rabbinical ideas from the time of those rabbis that you're quoting and citing.
Right.
So if you're going to
But they're
take them,
non-binding rabbinical
but
ideas.
if you're going
They're
to take
non-binding because they're not legally
binding or
binding.
not binding, the same rabbis that made the laws the way that you know them in the Mishnah also believed in a partially divine pre-existent Messiah, right? So that's incredibly problematic, right? Because
Wait, hold
then
on, hold on,
Judaism
hold on.
falls apart.
So that's incorrect. I mean, in terms of you're saying that there was some sort of consensus that the Messiah was divine in like in Mishnaic literature, it
It's
there is
it's
no
it
consensus.
it's in the literature and then it's never refuted. So I would assume that it's consensus.
Oh, well, that doesn't mean it's okay. So in
Like there's
terms
no
of when
rabbi,
these books were
right? So Hillel
compiled,
says Hillel says, right?
uh
There's no Messiah, and everyone jumps down his throat and says that's ridiculous. When somebody says the Messiah is pre-existent at the time of creation and has a conversation with God, and God shows him the suffering that he's going to have, and he agrees with God and says, "I'll take on that suffering." This is a pre-existent Messiah to the world, right? That nobody jumps down their throat and says, "No, that's ridiculous." That's obviously right. There's no
well,
debate on that.
that's not how the Talmud is compiled. It was compiled by the Savarim much, much, much later. That they even themselves, there's portions that there's a way to know when Savarim actually inserted certain ideas that weren't in the original text, only because there happens not to be people like jumping down the throat of this individual or that individual when they said this or that. Doesn't mean that they're all in a room staying quiet and saying, like I may believe that the Messiah is divine. I have no issue believing with someone or like believing that the idea that the Messiah is divine is contrary to the Talmud because it doesn't talk about the notion. The Talmud is
It does. It
silent.
says the Messiah is a pre-existent, partially divine character.
No, no, no. I'm saying that it doesn't prohibit
Right.
believing that the Messiah is divine.
No,
I don't condemn
that's not
Christians.
prohibited in rabbinic Judaism from the time of the Talmud. That's not prohibited.
No, right, right. I'm saying it's not prohibited, but there isn't a consensus that the Messiah was to
I
be
mean, it's not
divine.
prohibited today either. We believe that Menachem Mendel
No.
Schneerson was
I'm
enclosed
like,
in a human body from a spark of the divine.
oh well. I mean, according to Chabad, right, right.
Right.
I'm pretty sure when they made that statement, I don't think they really cared on like what the Talmud had to talk about,
No.
like what their Rebbe could be or can't
Well,
be.
they didn't
But I
care about
agree
it when
that the
they said
Talmud doesn't
Shabtai
condemn
Tzvi is
the
the
idea.
Messiah, and they didn't care about it when they said
Right.
that Frank is the Messiah. Like,
No, again, I don't think that the Talmud condemns these ideas. However, there's no consensus that the rabbis in the Talmud believe that God, or right, that God would that Himself would be the Messiah. I mean, I have my own theory on how the notion actually arose. I think that
this is funny. And he's calling me crazy. Everything is pre-existent. We're all trapped in time. Don't even have the nerve to call me crazy again, buddy.
so. I believe that in the writings of the prophets, in that time, it's not a coincidence. Every time this notion of a Superman Messiah or a Messiah, someone like David, to arise, always appears when Israel has their back up against the wall. Is either right before they're going to go into exile, while they're either being occupied, or if they're already in exile. That means they're awaiting some sort of redemption. I think the idea tied to the notion that I mean Hashem ish milchama, that God would in some way fight wars and like in behalf of Israel, that He was going to come down and be the Messiah. Then I think the rabbis saw that as problematic. Now, again, I'm saying this as someone who doesn't view the books of the prophets as authoritative. The prophets saw that as the rabbis saw that mainly as authoritative and tried to tie it down to the notion of a human political leader, which is why Rabbi Akiva, which is probably the central figure of like Mishnaic literature, declared Bar Kokhba a non-divine individual as the Messiah. Right. So I mean, it's not that there was a
Right.
consensus. Like, if there was a consensus, then would they be worshiping Bar Kokhba? So I'm not disagreeing
Oh,
with
but
you that some
can you
people believe
imagine if
this.
Bar Kokhba had succeeded in defeating the Romans? How would they
Um,
have viewed him then?
so I don't think that they deified the Messiah as much as they deify him by the Amoraim in Babylon back then. This is why that Rabbi Akiva thought that a regular man, like granted, a great warrior, was to be the Messiah, someone like King David. I mean, I'm sure his ethical
Right,
attributes
except
were on
God
point
says
as
about
well.
150 billion times throughout the entire Tanakh that there is no savior but him. Right? So if the Messiah is going to be the savior of God, and there's a verse in which funny Tuvia Singer mistranslates on his website very conveniently, when God says, "So spoke the Lord God, King of Israel, and His Redeemer, the God," a very clear separation, referring to God twice. Right? You don't have to look to midrashic literature to see, like, even if you don't believe that that's justification for Christianity, you can admit from a Jewish perspective, it's incredibly problematic to say that the Tanakh demonstrates a pure monotheism with no ambiguity, right?
Yeah,
That's obviously a false statement, right? There's so much ambiguity about the
yeah.
nature of God,
No,
right?
I don't say that, by the way.
No, I understand,
You
which
know,
is why you say people could very validly be Christians, right? Or to
correct,
be,
right?
right? I think
So,
so. That's the thing, right? So I do want to. That is a good segue, I think, from a rabbinical perspective on consensus on Mishnaic law, right? How do you justify for yourself telling people that if they're not going to be Jewish, they ought to be Christians from a pragmatic standpoint?
I think if someone, what do you mean from a pragmatic? Like, I don't get it. Can you repeat it again? I'm sorry.
Right. So if you're following a Mishnaic second through third century, as at the very earliest, foundation of oral law that we can say is binding, right? And we're going to follow the consensus view from that. How can you tell people that don't want to be Jewish, that don't see the value in Judaism, well, at least be a Christian, because at least you'll be following more of the laws by default?
Well, I mean, like, and for that reason, exactly. The way I gauge
But if
what's
they're not
better.
Jewish, why would they be bound to that anyways?
No, it has nothing to do with being bound. I don't think no one is bound to keep
You're saying
anything,
from your
especially.
personal opinion, just a pragmatic answer
Oh,
to
for
them.
sure, because of the results of it. Nowadays, no one's bound to keep anything because there's no Sanhedrin to punish them. So I think the way I gauge the world of what's better and what's worse is who keeps more and less laws. I think these laws work not because the
Right, but
Sanhedrin
whether or not
says
you're
they
not going to
work.
be punished is not justification whether something's good or not. Meaning,
Oh,
you should do the right
correct,
thing whether
correct.
it's good or not. So if the right thing to do is not be a Christian from a theological standpoint for a Jew, right? How can somebody be told pragmatically it would be better if you're a Christian, and I'm going to advise that, even though theologically I think that counters my basis for my Torah?
Mhm.
That's
So,
my question.
so you're saying that the rabbinic position, I mean, I guess not my rabbinic position of what's taught
Well, let's
nowadays
say for
is
Jews,
not.
let's leave it even Christians
Oh,
who
so
are
then I have
not
nothing to
Gentiles
say
out
on
of it.
this issue. Like, I don't think the Talmud itself or the Mishnah condemns what a Christian believes. I mean, assuming that Christian accepts Torah, right? I
I
mean,
think I'm seeing in the comments. I think the question is misunderstood here. It's not whether or not the Talmud condemns Christianity. So what I'm asking is, if Judaism consensus is that at the very least it's forbidden for Jews to be Christians,
oh, but I
right?
don't care about Judaism's consensus. I care about the consensus of the Sanhedrin. According to the Sanhedrin, if 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 a Jewish Orthodox man starts to believe in Jesus as the Messiah and a Messiah with divine qualities, what Mishnaic law would they be breaking? None, right?
Worshiping a
I mean,
man in the form of God.
correct. Like, does
If
that
you
appear
don't,
in the Mishnah? It does not.
it appears in the Torah.
No. Okay. If
You
you're
don't need the
saying,
Mishnah for that
wait,
one.
wait, 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 hold
If
on, hold on,
if
hold on.
Jesus is not God,
Okay,
you are definitely forbidden from worshiping
hold on.
him.
Okay. If you say, I'm worshiping a man who claims to be God, that's a problem. If you're saying, I'm worshiping God who in some way embodied a man, right? There's a loophole in that. And this is why there was a loophole for Shabtai Tzvi when he claimed to be God. There's a loophole like for Lubavitchers who
The
believe that a
loophole is
Rebbe is
shituf. The Ramah talks about that Jews are not permitted, but
correct.
Gentiles are. It's not idolatrous,
But
but it
Shituf
is
doesn't
for
appear in the Talmud.
it's idolatrous for Jews.
Yes, but the Ramah lived in the Middle Ages. Shituf doesn't appear
Right.
in the
The
Talmud
Ramah's
definition.
stance is more lenient, not less lenient. The Ramah is the most lenient stance, saying
Right.
it's
The Rambam
permissible for
believes that
Gentiles.
Christians are not idolaters
Right.
because the prohibition of shituf doesn't apply in Gentiles. The
Right.
Rambam disagrees, but the whole notion of shituf is not prohibited in the Talmud. It's Tosfos on the Talmud, and the Ramah is in line
Right.
with Tosfos because he's on the
But
same
that's the
line as him.
lenient view, right? So
Right, but
the
that's modern day Judaism. I mean, that has nothing to do with what the Mishnah has to
right,
say.
the
The
Mishnaic version would
Mishnah,
be if Jesus is not God, you're forbidden to worship him as God.
well, I don't think the Mishnah ever spoke on this topic. This is why I
No,
believe
I
it's
mean
a
you
gray
can't put,
area.
but you can't point everything to a specific. You can't cover every topic. Meaning, it's
Well, I mean,
forbidden
if
to
it's not
worship a man as
prohibited,
God
okay, so like,
from the
if they
Torah,
don't
not from the
condemn it,
Mishnah. Like, let's go even further back. The
if wait,
Torah
wait, hold on, hold on.
forbids it.
Well, okay, so the Torah itself does not prohibit the idea of God becoming a man, because this, if you read it straight through, there's instances that shows God becoming a man. The Rambam says that any sort of interaction like that only happened in a dream because we can't limit God in such a manner. That's the Rambam in putting his philosophy. However, the idea that God cannot become a man is contrary to the Torah. You could believe that, but in spite of what appears in the Torah, that's why the Rambam had to take such a leap. The Talmud itself doesn't speak on this issue, so then we can't say that the Mishnah would have been against the idea. Now, the idea that people have thrown Torah laws away, that's a lot more problematic than believing that God embodied a man for 33 years. So I think that if someone
So you're
is,
totally okay with the idea that Jesus could have been God theoretically.
uh, I don't think it breaks any Torah statement or Mishnaic statement. I'm not saying that I believe it. I mean, something could
Okay.
sound silly. Something could be philosophically problematic and not idolatrous or heretical from a Talmudic perspective. I know nowadays people have a very limited vocabulary, so they'll call you heretic and idolater from the outset. I mean, the two most heavy, like the biggest insults that cause your life not to be prolonged in the Jewish world, just because you could believe in the same Torah, but you conclude that the Messiah is an embodiment of the invisible God, you're automatically, to be unalive. I mean, that makes no sense to me. I may not believe it, but I'm not going to condemn someone as a heretic or idolater if they do, because the mission doesn't condemn them.
Okay, but the consent. So this is where I guess there's an issue. So you really don't believe that the Jewish world is doing Judaism right at the end of the day.
I think that they're fulfilling their requirements, okay, but I think that they're outside of their jurisdiction to take it upon themselves to decide something as idolatrous when the Mishnah is silent on the issue.
I have to address this one. Sorry. This Deuteronomy 4:15 is a prohibition against crafting anything to worship as God, or against worshiping things that are crafted in nature as God, not if God himself decided to look like a man. That's the problem. This is a misquote here. This is about crafting graven images and work to worship them, or about worshiping like the sun or things like that. Not if God decided that he wants to look like a man. If God says that he looks like a man, then it wouldn't be in violation of the prohibition. So you'd
So
have
it
to
sounds like you agree with me.
you'd have to
I mean, it sounds like,
I agree with you 100% on this issue. I mean, you'd have to
well, the Mishnah agrees
presuppose
on,
that
okay.
the modern rabbinical take is correct to use Deuteronomy 4:15 in that context.
Yeah, but have you given me an example of some Mishnaic ruling that you actually disagree with as contrary to the Torah?
I think we're in agreement on a lot of. I think we're much more in agreement than I would have thought from the last conversation on what Judaism actually is for you. I think that there's a theological element missing for you that I can't reconcile personally. Um, but I don't
Right, which
think
is essentially optional to believe.
right
Anything
at the end of the
theological,
day you're not even you're saying that you have very much the freedom to intellectually choose based on very ambiguous early rabbinic tradition that is very much up for debate still, to choose from that how you want to practice Judaism. From a pragmatic standpoint, it's valuable. From a biblical standpoint, it's the closest thing that we can get to. And the tradition, at the very least, holds that if you're at that point already, anything beyond that is so arbitrary and minhagim that you couldn't condemn somebody for not following it one way or the other.
so I don't think these laws are so ambiguous. I think for the most part, if I put on a pair of tefillin, how they're designed today, it fulfills every requirement brought down by the Mishnah and adds a few like by the MRI, but the requirements are fulfilled. That means I have no issue in some way adopting minhagim in my life as long as I acknowledge that this is not halacha, right? But I don't want to be what's called tivrosh min hatzibor. I don't want to separate myself from the community, but I make a distinction. The requirements are being meant in the Mishnah. Thank God for some sort of unity, because at least Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox still keep the holidays on the same day. because of that, because everyone acknowledges that that at one time there was consensus, perhaps not like factually or historically, but in faith. So I think that that I mean it's quite liberating. I mean, from that perspective, that we can actually keep laws in a uniform manner and not condemn each other to hell like every Shabbos or every Sunday, right? Mainly because these topics were never spoken about by the only court that had authority to develop at least practical ideas, right? Because I don't believe the Sanhedrin had authority to establish anything metaphysical, just the practical and essentially the ceremonial, because ethical laws, really, anything they had to say on the issue is what we call like midat hasidut.
Right.
Because there are no legal, ramifications for not loving your neighbor as yourself. I mean, how do you adjudicate that? How do you adjudicate what's in your heart? How do you circumcise your heart? Right? I mean, they may have comments on what to say, but it wouldn't be authoritative.
Right.
What their authority is, what we call halacha lemaisa, what you do, the laws you do, but not how you feel. And even if, like you said, like whether you believe in God or not.
Right. Okay. I think I have a pretty clear understanding now. I definitely agree with you more. Yeah, I think like there is a narrative there that's being missed on a theological stand if you take the prophets more seriously, but I don't think you do. I mean, it's poetic language for you in that sense. But I want to address one more comment here, and then I want to move on to something else if you have time. This does not preclude the fact that God says you saw no voice, you saw a voice and did not hear anything. There's two problems with demonizing Christianity over this verse. Number one, the fact that the Israelite people at the time did not see a shape of God does not mean he doesn't have a shape. That's a logical fallacy. Number two, uh, Moses, who's right, bringing the Torah to the Jewish people from God, did see God. So did Abraham, and so did others. And you'd have to concoct a story afterwards that it's metaphorical in order to dismiss that. So, right, that doesn't again, it doesn't preclude that God could look like a man. The other problem with saying this as proof that God could not have a corporeal form is that you'd have to believe then that whoever wrote the Torah was an idiot and did not understand basics of physics, which they didn't. But if you're talking about a inspired scripture, it wouldn't matter if they understand physics or not, because a voice is a corporeal form. Meaning, if God has a voice that creates vibrations, if we want to, nitpick here, then having a voice would make you a corporeal form by itself. No, it's not eisegesis. I mean, that's just fact. A voice is a corporeal form of sorts. So, does God have a voice literally? Like, does he have a physical voice that makes vibrations in the air? Like, that's like you could always go down to the basic level of it. But if you have time here, um, I
Well,
want to
these are kind of
address.
missionary talking points 101, and
I mean,
I
yeah, I
think they're
mean,
quite
but
destructive.
it's irrelevant. That's what I tell people that when I'm talking to people who are Christian, and I'm going back and forth with them now. It's like, yeah, but this is in the Bible. That's in the God in this form and shadows and types of Jesus. I'm like, it doesn't help your case, right? Nor does it help the rabbinic case in the reverse. Like, neither of these are going to prove each other wrong from these verses. It's just not going to happen. Um, I want to address the Noahide thing because I think you know more about it than I do. I didn't know. I knew that it was silly, right? But I didn't know how silly, and I didn't know how cult like it was until people started commenting on my videos. I saw a video of one of these Noahide rabbi like leaders talking about how this wonderful mitzvah, this guy donated a kidney to a Jewish guy, how big of a mitzvah this is. That like it's nice to donate a kidney to somebody, but not if you think you're getting a place in heaven for it. That seems insane to me. I didn't even like this guy's so happy and proud that he was able to give a Jewish person a kidney. And it's like what do you know about that and what's going on there? Like what is the problem with the Noahide movement at its core?
It has nothing to do with the Noahide laws in terms of like embellishing the Jewish people. Um, so, well, the idea of the Noahide laws is a theoretical one, a hypothetical one. Throughout Jewish history, there never existed a Noahide community. It never, I mean, a community in the Talmud, it was, they never existed. With the only instance we have of non-Jews living amongst us, at least during the Second Temple times, were the God-fearers. And they didn't limit themselves to seven laws. They kept every law with the exception of circumcision in most cases. So, as a matter of fact, it's a debate in the Talmud on how many laws a Gentile has to keep. There's one place that says 7, another place says 30. There's another place that says they have to keep them all. I think because the Rif and the Rambam basically settled on the 7, everyone sort of ran with that. The the question it tries to answer is that how do you adjudicate Gentiles living in biblical lands when they never formally accepted the Torah? I mean, do they
Right.
have to keep Yom Kippur? I mean, do they have to, like, is there a prohibition in like in shatnez? So they theorized that there's a standard of 7 laws that separates them essentially from the animal that they have to keep. They want to reside amongst us or even traverse through our lands, which makes sense. However, like most practical rulings in Judaism, um, mysticism creeps in like a virus and gives it a spin. And now we believe that 6 laws were given to Adam and the 7th law was given to Noah. And they go further and they teach that if they keep these 7 laws, um, because like they believe in the godly aspect of it coming from God, that they also get a share in the world to come. So now people are deciding on their own uh, what other standard does God validate when God only validates a Torah standard from that perspective. Now, like, what does the Torah have to say of differences between Gentiles and Jews and adjudication? Well, it says that regarding the Vela, like animals that die on their own, that we're allowed to give them to like strangers among us, right? I mean, that's the extent of what the Torah has to say of how differently Gentiles have to behave versus Jews. But with the exception of, like if they choose not to circumcise themselves, from that perspective, there's just one standard for the both. So it's completely, theoretical. And the Talmud itself, in 2 places, it states that God abolished the Noahide laws, and for some reason they exclude that when giving it over to Gentiles. The problem I have with the system, okay, it was essentially Chabad that invented the Noahide movement, not the Noahide laws, but because Chabad believes that they're living in the Messianic age, right? The laws of like the 7 laws of the children of Noah mainly appear in like Hilchot Melachim of the Rambam, which is a sefer that deals mainly with Yemot HaMashiach. So the understanding is that when Israel's in charge, you're supposed to coerce the nations to adopt this standard of 7 laws on threat of death. Not to mention that if they break any one of these laws, they have to be decapitated with only one witness and no hasra, no pre-warning. The problem is if you're a Lubavitcher and like you drive around in the midst of a tank promoting the 7 Noah laws, you don't tell people that according to their understanding, everyone who believes in Jesus breaks the first of these laws of idolatry. So they're basically saying that whether you thrust these laws upon yourself or not, you're going to be decapitated in a messianic age. Um, so that's pretty much the Noahide laws in a nutshell. The major problem I have with it is that when somebody comes to convert nowadays, they offer this as an alternative to conversion for people who have already chosen the Torah as a standard, telling them
Right.
why would you want to convert when you could only keep these 7 laws and make it to heaven? I mean, that's a nomenclature. Keep the 7 and go to heaven. When there was a debate in the Talmud if righteous Gentiles, and it never says 7 laws, stam, if righteous Gentiles get a place in the world to come. Beit Shammai said no. Rabbi Eliezer basically was under Beit Shammai. They said no. Beit Hillel, I believe Rabbi Yeshua said yes. But it's taught so matter of factly nowadays. Why would you want to become Jewish when all you have to do is X, Y, and Z? Right. So I think it's irresponsible that when somebody comes to you for guidance, saying like, "What's the most secure way to serve the God of Israel?" Right? You don't tell them, "Well, keep the Torah," but instead say, "Adopt a standard that is full of debate. There's no
And that you would
consensus on."
basically keep by default by following secular law in most cases.
Right. And this is where many people, like let's say Rav Kook, like believe that even Muslims fulfill that role, and this is why they have the whole Chet Mechira, and they believe that Muslims can live in the land. Um, right, right. Well, in terms of not well, like Abraham Minachai, like I don't know if secular Jews. I mean, Japanese people eat live things all the time.
Well, most secular countries would prohibit you from torturing animals by law, which eating a limb from a live animal would probably fall under that. So even that would be kept under secular law in most Western countries.
Hmm.
So I mean, the idea that you're going to tell somebody who wants to be like you believe in Judaism, and somebody goes, "I believe in Judaism too, but I wasn't born Jewish," and you're going to tell them, "Well, uh, just keep keeping secular law and talk about how great Jews are." That's kind of silly to me,
Yeah.
um, and to the point that it seems like a cult, to be honest. Like it seems
Yeah,
like
for sure.
a new age cult, and the hypocrisy to say that Christian missionaries are evil for what they're doing to convert Jews, but you're going to convince Christians to be Noahides instead. I mean,
Yeah.
like why not
Yeah. So
convert them
Jews
to
do
Judaism then?
proselytize. So Jews proselytize. Well, ideally, ideologically, as much as Christians feel a need to proselytize, they just proselytize the Noahide laws, which is really a form of Judaism. You can't believe in the Noahide laws unless you believe in the rabbis. And I'm not even going to say rabbinic authority because there's this notion that it's in some way an alternative to Judaism. It's absurd. If you want to say the
I
rabbinic
have
Judaism
Noahide
is
people commenting on my channel, quoting rabbis who are alive today as though it were scripture, which is
yeah,
like, and then like if the halacha is that you can only study Torah as a non-Jew, to the degree that you need to learn Noahide laws, how do you even know what they are? How do you even know what the authority there is? How do you know who to trust? How do you know what the backing for it is? You can't. You just have to pick a rabbi. Go. I believe in the God of Israel. The Jews must be right. They told me they're right, so I'm going to follow that rabbi who told me what I'm supposed to do.
yeah. Well,
That's the predicament that you're stuck in. And they come across. I'm sure these people are not stupid, but they come across dumb as rocks because they
I
literally
think
can't cite anything outside of what the rabbi that they're Noahide under is telling them.
I think it's absurd for someone who as a Christian stood so proudly on Scripture. I mean, they would war with anyone trying to misinterpret, to in some way change their Bible, and now completely build their religious existence on a rabbinic opinion.
Right.
I think it's completely absurd. I think that if you want to serve God in the most secure way possible, keep His commandments, because that's how we worship God. We serve God by keeping His commandments, right? And God makes no distinction between laws.
So you'd also put every single law on the same footing in that sense.
Oh, absolutely. I believe that if anyone is convinced that the Torah is true, and Maimonides writes this in the first, like halacha, the first chapter of Hilchos Mamrim, he says anyone who believes in the Torah of Moses is bound to keep even rabbinic laws, because his argument is that the authority of the Sanhedrin appears in the Torah. So for him to make that claim, he was like, he would also have to conclude, if you believe that the Torah is true, then you're also bound to the rulings of the Sanhedrin. If you believe it's true to yourself, not that the Sanhedrin is going to adjudicate you for breaking it because you never formally accepted the commandments, like in any formal manner. But for you to be true to what you believe in the God of Israel, you believe that the God of Israel authorizes the Sanhedrin, then you should also believe in the rulings of the Sanhedrin.
So I think from this, I wanted to, so I like I said at the beginning, I did want to push back here and get kind of a to the grid of it of how you justify um your stance on these things. And I think so if I can summarize in conclusion a few major points here. Number one, you do believe in an authority based on faith, you believe in an authority that goes back to Moses that ended about the time of the Mishnah. From there on, it's rational discussion about the Mishnah and back.
Yes,
Correct?
but this authority does not include anything metaphysical, just the practical, how you keep
Just the
ceremonial laws.
practical. So how to keep the law of the Torah.
Correct. The consensus, not just laws of the Torah. I believe they had the authority to establish what we call takanas and gezeras, like decrees and edicts, in some way to build fences. However, they were in some way, like in many ways, they were fallible. And we should only follow them as long as they do not desecrate the Torah.
Okay. So you believe in that authority on the laws only from the rabbis going up until the point of the Mishnah, and then you think that consensus is valuable for discerning and then rational thought for picking and choosing, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then you think that the metaphysical on that front, it's okay to believe whatever you want on the metaphysical as long as you're keeping the laws. I'm still not sure if you see theological problematic things as far as idolatry, because that believing something idolatrous is not necessarily. I see. So you're saying idolatry is only the physical act of bowing to an idol or declaring an idol God, not thinking of God in ways that are not permissible.
Uh, so I believe that the Mishnah also had authority to establish actual avodah zarah. I mean, now that phrase doesn't appear in the Torah. It literally means worshiping God in a way that He didn't prescribe. So if someone behaved in such a manner, I believe the court had the authority to exclude such people from the community. Um, Even possibly put people in harem, like if not unalive them. So from that perspective, it's still dealing with practice, right? It doesn't matter what you believe necessarily. Like you didn't even have to believe in the Sanhedrin as long as you obeyed the Sanhedrin. But I believe that the metaphysical is limited to what appears in the 5 books of Moses. That's metaphysical authority in Judaism. The practical authority appears both in the written and the rulings of the like men with smicha in the Sanhedrin.
Okay. And so there's the law that follows, there's what's permissible theologically, not theologically. You can take any of the metaphysical things that any of the rabbis said and you can kind of think about it as you like, as long as
Right.
you're keeping the laws properly throughout that time. You believe in proselytizing for sure. Uh, you should absolutely try to convert people to Judaism as opposed to letting them be Noahides at all. You would agree with me on that, that's an absurd um, branch
I
of the
think it's
rabbinical tradition
better.
that's come out.
I think it's better to possibly remain a Christian than become a Noahide. If I'm going to gauge the world as what I
You're
consider
saying
better or
pragmatically
worse,
here, not
correct.
right.
Well, like
Or keeping more
I'm
laws, literally.
correct, but I'm still of the opinion that the rabbis in the Mishnah would not have condemned the messianic. So, I mean, I have no issue there. But if I would gauge the world in terms of what's better and what's worse, I think someone who keeps more laws is better than someone who keeps less. And I think Christians, e- even Presbyterians or Methodists, keep more laws by mistake than Noahites keep on purpose.
Right. And then, so on that front, and then, where was I going there? You still don't have any particular truth claim about the nature of God in any capacity that you think is valid to bring up at all.
Well, just that the foundation of our religion, of what makes him God, is essentially that he's just and he's righteous. And I know that anyone could claim that for themselves, but my proof, my evidence for that is this book, Civilizing This Planet, for the most part. The main book that has civilized this planet, I believe, is the commandments that appear in the Torah specifically.
Okay. And then so that's on the theological standpoint. And then there was one thing that I wanted to clear up from the last time. Um, the idea of prophecy. You think that God does not necessarily know the future.
I'm convinced of that idea, and I also believe that every prophecy is conditional. So, like, if someone claims, "Well, he says this and that, how can he have not known the future?" It appears twice clearly in the Bible. In where's the verse now? Let me think. Like in Jeremiah, I believe chapter 18, and Ezekiel. I'll get you the verse. I mean, I'll read it now. Also, that I mean, it clearly tells you on how prophecy functions. That people think like, well, how could he have prophesied this? But it's every statement that he makes, whether it's positive or negative, or whether it's a promise or a curse, is always contingent on our behavior. So, I mean, from that perspective, any example that someone could give me about God knowing the future, if whatever he said came to pass, is because we did from our part. So, I mean, essentially, he's taking educated guesses. And I don't view this as a limitation because God not knowing the future is not a limitation if there is no future to be known. And there's a rabbi called Rabbi Levi ben Gershom Gershonides who came to this conclusion. The Rambam touches on this a lot. He doesn't come out and say this straight through, but there's an understanding that what God actually knows is what's called kohota teva, like the forces of nature, whether it's going to rain or not, but on like, whether you're going to do teshuvah, like whether you're going to choose the right path over the wrong path, that would in some way violate our free will. If God knew what you were going to do before you were going to do it and still had the audacity to punish you for it.
Well, the problem of the justifications on whether or not God does know things or doesn't know things, based on the final result of whether or not we have free will. The problem with that is at a fundamental logical level, and you'd have to presuppose natures of God and what like that he doesn't talk about in any of the scriptures about about that,
Mm.
which you'd have to decide, do I believe more in free will or do I believe more in the all powerfulness of God? And those are contradictory things that are absolutely a mystery that you cannot come to a conclusion about and have any intellectually consistent standpoint. You have to accept those as a mystery if you believe in God.
Yeah, no, for
Um,
sure. This isn't a science, by the way. Yeah, but I have this verse, Ezekiel chapter 33, for those online who want to follow along. In terms of promises being conditional and curses being conditional. Ezekiel 33, verse 13 through 16. It says, if if I tell a righteous person that they will surely live, but then they trust in their righteousness and do evil, none of the righteous things that the person has done will be remembered. They will die for the evil they have done. If if I say to a wicked person that you will surely die, but then they turn away from their sin and do what is just and right, if they give back what they took in pledge for a loan, return what they have stolen, follow the decrees that give life, and do no evil, that person will surely live. They will not die. None of the sins that a person has committed will be remembered against them. They have done what is just and right, uh, uh, they will surely live. So here it's telling you, because there's many people who make the statement that if God says something, it will not come back void. This tells you that it doesn't matter if God says that this will happen to this nation. If that nation would repent, it will not happen. So we should stop viewing the supposed prophecies of God, or what appears in the books of the prophets, as an almanac of things to come that must occur, because that would violate our free will.
so you definitely
There's
don't
another
really
statement in
believe
Jeremiah
in.
that says the same
Okay,
thing.
yeah, and you definitely don't believe in a Messiah in the way that rabbinic Judaism or Christianity puts it forth.
I believe in it in the way that Maimonides puts it forth, which is a minority opinion. Like most people claim to go by the Rambam's understanding of the Messiah, like in Hilchos Malachim, they claim to go by it, but they don't, because they believe in a Superman Messiah. Like what the Rambam holds, like Shmuel, like Rav Shmuel, who's in Amara and the Gemara, says that in the Messianic age, even under the auspices of the Messiah, nothing is going to change, with the exception of Jews having sovereignty over themselves. In terms of the nations, automatically um, like becoming peaceful, he says that's only towards Israel, but amongst themselves, they're going to keep on warring and doing what they do. As long as we stay on the right path, if we screw it up, we're going to go into exile again.
You're getting called out here for quoting the prophets when you said they're optional.
No, no, no. Okay. So I'm laying down for those who believe that the prophet's true. First of all, I made the statement from the Torah that a prophet can add or take away, and that it
Right.
would violate our free will. That our job is to listen to the prophet when he's there to bring us back to Torah observance. The notion that someone thinks that anything that appears later on could in some way override free will is a later developed idea that they've embraced for themselves. Now I'm showing you that the prophets themselves are telling you that this is not what they're trying to do. So I'm not, like, I'm using it for a proof for those who already elevate the prophets, to divinely inspired
What
scripture.
what what you're saying though is that essentially, no matter where you look, and I think you'd agree with me on this, you're never gonna get from from a verse or passage in the Bible a conclusion to the mystery of how free will and the absolute all powerfulness of God can coexist.
Correct. You're never.
Right.
I mean, it's for sure not a science. However, I think that that really solidifies what being an ethical monotheist really means. That our goal, right, to even remain in this belief system, is to give over an ethical message to the world. And I think that yes, for the most part, the Torah is ethical, but there's a way that you could look at it that could in some way nullify every moral aspect of the Torah. Like, I mean, someone could think that God chose Israel because Israel chose God, or you could believe that God chose Israel because we're superhuman, right? So an ethical monotheist would look at it and say, no, no. Now, what's the ethical message? What's God really trying to tell me where everyone could win? So, I mean, this reiterates a statement that I also don't feel it's authoritative, that there is a way that seems right for a man but leads to destruction. That means I don't believe that the Torah is there to make you good. I believe it's there to make you better. If you're a crappy person with crappy intentions and you come to religion or Torah, your Torah is going to look crappy. Okay, but if you're a decent person, then your Torah and your religiosity is going to shine that much more. Because I believe everyone's born with a basic sense of morality. By the way, but it's too basic that It's only basic enough to get you to the doorsteps of some sophisticated belief system that's going to drag you the rest of the way. So that's my answer on that.
Okay. All right. I think we got into the grit of it a lot more this time. I appreciate you coming on and actually going through the motions there and try to figure out where, like, you know, the intellectual conversation, the historical and validity of things. Um, and at the end of the day, I think we're probably more in agreement than I originally thought on what Judaism ought to look like if you want to go to Judaism as your um, if you're going to believe in Judaism and say, well, I do believe in the Torah, I believe we have to keep it. How do we do that? I think you do have a valid method there. I'd agree with that more. So I still think there's a theological component missing that does not justify it for me. But if you're already going to presuppose that that has to be fulfilled, meaning keeping the laws of the Torah in that way, then I would say that I agree with you on that stance. My question then is, as a closing thing, how do you propose you make some changes in the Jewish Orthodox world to have a more rational stance towards it in that way? Meaning, in keeping the halachot, in keeping with the I don't want to say the spirit of the law in a Christian sense here because we're talking strictly Judaism as to this question. The spirit of the law, meaning what does God want from you, and then also on a meaning basically what how do you keep with that? If you're already going to believe in Judaism, how do you follow that because you believe in it and you want to be the closest thing to how to keep the Torah law? How do you propose getting that to the Jewish community at large in an Orthodox sense?
I think we have to start with the Torah. I think we have to stop saying that we cannot understand the Torah without the rabbis. I think that's the most absurd statement. It completely washes out the whole purpose of Torah, which is essentially to sensitize the world with the will of God. Right? If someone makes a statement that you can't understand this without that, what you have done is elevated the ladder. So Torah should interpret itself from an ethical and moral perspective. I believe we need consensus to understand ceremonial law, nationalistic law, things that we're supposed to keep in unison so we can move forward. But ethically, if you can't fall in love with the God of Israel by the plain ethics and morals that appear in the Torah, then the Torah is not for you. That's the first thing. That the spirit of the law has to appear in the written law. Second, I would make a distinction between Agadah, Halacha, and Torah Shebiktav. Okay, Agadah is essentially disposable. I'm sure there's some beautiful ideas in midrashic literature, just like there's some silly ideas in midrashic literature. They don't change. It doesn't affect how you keep one mitzvah or one halacha, nor should it. So that's essentially it. And I include Kabbalah as midrashim that people take too literally. That's
I, I
pretty
have
much
a
it. I
I
mean,
have a much less charitable view towards Kabbalah than you do, I think.
yeah. Well, I mean, I'm trying to
But so
kind of play both sides of the field here.
well, I mean, yeah, I mean, there's a consensus. There's a cultural aspect of this that you could easily be condemned and demonized for stepping outside of certain lines, which is, I think, one of the problems. So I ask again, how do you propose not only bringing Gentiles in through proselytizing to becoming Jewish, if you think that that's the way to do it? Again, that's where we disagree, of course, but
Yeah.
not in proselytizing. I don't have anything against proselytizing. I'm saying theologically I disagree with you. But if I were to agree on the proselytizing part, if you think it's true, you should definitely be converting people to Judaism for sure. Not Noahides. Not it's okay if you stay a Christian. You should be Jewish from that perspective. How do you propose though that you change the Jewish world to accept that?
It's interesting with the influence that the Rambam has, but people ignore the systematic theology he put forth on how to actually understand Jewish law. I think if people study Maimonides more, what, they would realize what's optional and what's obligatory. I mean, that's really what Judaism is made up of. What you're obligated to do and what extracurricular idea. Uh, I mean, like you could peddle like via your Shabbos table. Um, I mean, like I'm really not sure. I try to have dialogues with Orthodox people, but sometimes sometimes it's easier um, to make a kosher Jew by 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 encouraging a Christian to drop Christianity and embrace Judaism than to have someone unlearn years and years of indoctrination. If you grew up Chabad and your whole life you're convinced that the Tanya was given on Mount Sinai, how can you unlearn that? However, if you take a Christian who embrace this notion of sola scriptura, which I believe has kept them pure enough to make probably the best Jews, right? I mean, there's something you can work with there. I think it's easier to teach someone who knows less than someone who knows more. Um, wow,
You're saying Orthodox Jews are too embedded in the well.
they're too
This is
indoctrinated.
the
I
point
mean,
that I
they're
brought up about violating very clear biblical and rabbinical injunctions in favor of less important minhagim, right? So I had an interesting thing. A certain member of the family eating a cookie that was dairy 3 hours after eating something that was chicken, and being like yelled at over it when nobody else would have noticed that it was even happening. Like, don't do it in front of the kids. But it's like your kids wouldn't have even seen, like, noticed that the person ate a cookie if you didn't bring it up. But what you're doing is a violating a biblical injunction, out of certain respects and love for your neighbor over a rabbinical injunction. Not only that, a earlier rabbinical injunction from Rabbi Akiva saying, "Hey, this Avat Yisrael thing is probably more important than a lot of the other things that you think are important." Right? This loving your neighbor stuff is pretty serious. I think something that Jews and Christians ought to agree on, at least that. And then you're going to violate a biblical injunction and then a rabbinical injunction in favor of a later minhag, and that's mainstream.
mm,
That is the Jewish world in a nutshell.
yeah. I mean, to what degree? It depends. If someone feels that doing that is equivalent to eating a piece of pork, I mean, sometimes we do elevate. I mean, the ceremonial. I mean, it does carry weight. The same God who said, "Don't eat pork." If you believe that not mixing basar v'chalav is just as important as not mixing wool and linen, I could see why that should cause concern. But for sure, it should be done in the right way. People should never be embarrassed, especially if they did it by mistake. I I agree with you. Like, I don't know how to win over most Orthodox Jews. I try to have many discussions with Orthodox Jews. They see my point, and they, at least, I'm able to see where we differ. Right? To quote Dennis Prager, with Orthodox Jews, I see clarity to agreement. And it typically always boils down to Kabbalah, or in some way them deifying any rabbinic opinion from Amoraim, Gaonim, Achronim, Kabbalists, as all being given on Mount Sinai. They've dumbified Judaism. Now, in more academic circles, I like it more when yeshiva guys actually make a distinction. Oh yeah, no, this is a brisa. This is this. I mean, this is a mishnah. I can have a dialogue with people like that, but I think that's probably the main reason I believe in proselytizing, because I think
I have
that
to address this
converts are
here.
going to save
I'm not
Judaism.
sounding like Manis Friedman. I'm not saying that sins don't matter or that sins are okay to do and love is the most important thing. What I'm saying is you shouldn't abuse people over a rabbinical injunction. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think you take these comments way too seriously. Ignore those comments. Yeah, no, but like I think converts saved Jews during the Second Temple. Like for the most part, the Shemaiah of Talion, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Akiva, Onkelos, and I think converts are going to save Judaism now, and this is why I proselytize. um, that we need new blood with some sort of fresh perspective, with some clear systematic theology that they could package up and hand over to someone else that they can defend. I don't think the average Orthodox Jew could defend what they believe. Right? All they do is, I mean, they have these counter missionary talking points that aren't really built on anything. And the same counter missionary that's telling you that this is prohibited believes what you already believe in a more decrepit manner, but they'll, it I don't think it's defendable how it exists today. I think Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, is defendable in the way that I teach it. And even if I take the less is more perspective, that it's easier to defend your position when it embraces less concepts, or less accepted,
So you don't think there is a way
visions.
to change the viewpoints? You think you need to out convert the birth rate of the Orthodox Jews, essentially?
Unfortunately.
Okay. All right. That's kind of like at the end of that. I wanted to know what is the solution, and uh, I don't know if you can out convert the birth rate of Hasidic Jews.
Well, it's interesting. The Orthodox Jewish community does have a bit of a herd mentality. I mean, sometimes all you need is one gadol, or two gadolim to do something, and the whole Jewish world just followed suit. So I mean, you never know. It's interesting how that works. I mean, look, like when Rabbi Vada Yosef, said something about like shaitels, and everyone, well, the next day is burning shaitelach all over the streets of Meir Sharim and Gola. So I mean, it's you know, weirder things have happened. So
Yeah, well, thank you for coming on again, and I really appreciate you giving me the time to actually to work through those things. I know that it can get taxing to go through those motions like over and over again, but sometimes when you're trying to get like a clear idea of what a system is, what the belief system is, how you go about things, how you do what you say you're going to do, sometimes it's necessary. I really appreciate you giving me the time to get a clearer understanding, and I think at the end of the day, again, other than certain key theological differences where I do want to point to truth in some way and I want to figure that out, other than that side of it, I think on a aspect of understanding the Jewish community and um, what your take there is and the Noahide thing and practicalities of how you want to go about things and what you intend for the Jewish community in your ideal, I think I probably agree with you on even more than I thought last time. So I do appreciate that. And this is look at this. Therapy is good, Ash. You don't need therapy. You need a steak. Nobody needs therapy. You need to eat a steak. Can we agree on that at least? Come on, give me a yes. Yes, eat a steak. That's as much therapy as you need.
I agree.
Let's see. Well, anyways, have a good night. And I thank you for that again. Thank you for the time.
Okay, no problem. Be well.
Come on, give me the answer. Is steak good enough?